Saint. Lawrence is popularly believed to have been named by a group of shipwrecked sailors from Sir Humphrey Gilbert's ship, the Delight, which went down off Sable Island in 1583. The following account of their ordeal was written by Richard Clarke, master of the Delight, in defense of his actions, and was published by Richard Hakluyt in his Principal Navigations. A relation of Richard Clarke of Weymouth, master of the ship called the Delight, going for the discovery of Morumbega with Sir Humphrey Gilbert 1583, written in excuse of that fault of casting away the ship and men, imputed to his oversight, departing out of St. John's Harborough in the Newfoundland the 20th of August unto Cape Raz. From thence we directed our course unto the He of Sablon or the Isle of Sand, which the generally Sir Humphrey Gilbert would willingly have seen. But when we came within 20 leagues of the Isle of Sablon, we feel to controversy of our course. The generale came up in his frigate, and demanded of me, Richard Clarke, master of the Admiral, what course was best to keep. I said that west-southwest was best, because the wind was at south and night at hand, and unknown sands lay off a great way from land. The generally commanded me to go west-northwest. I told him again that the Isle of Sablon was west-northwest and but 15 leagues off, and that he should be upon the island before day, if he went that course. The generale said, my reckoning was untrue, and charged me in Her Majesty's name, and as I would shew myself in her country, to follow him that night. I, fearing his threatenings, because he presented Her Majesty's person, did follow his commandment, and about 7 o'clock in the morning the ship stroke on ground, where she was cast away. Then the generally went off to sea, the course that I would have had them gone before, and saw the ship cast away men and all, and was not able to save a man, for there was not water upon the sand for either of them, much lessee for the Admiral, that drew 14 foot. Now, as God would, the day before it was very calmy, and a soldier of the ship had killed some fowl with his piece, and some of the company desired me that they might hoist out the boat to recover the fowl, which I granted them, and when they came aboard they did not hoist it in again on that night. And when the ship was cast away, the boat was astern, being in burthen 1 ton and a half there was left in the boat 1 oar and nothing else. Some of the company could swim, and recovered the boat, and did hail in out of the water as many men as they could. Among the rest they had a care to watch for the captain, or the master. They happened on myself being the master, but they could never see the captain. Then they hailed into the boat as many men as they could in number 16, whose names hereafter I will rehearse. And when the 16 were in the boat, some had small remembrance, and some had none, for they did not make account to live, but to prolong their lives as long as it pleased God, and looked every moment of an horror when the sea would eat them up, the boat being so little and so many men in her, and so foul weather, that it was not possible for a ship to brook half a course of sail. Thus while we remained 2 days and 2 nights, and that we saw it pleased God, our boat lived in the sea, although we had nothing to help us withal but 1 oar, which we kept up the boat withal upon the sea. And so went even as the sea would drive us. There was in our company one Master Headley that put forth this question to me, the master: I do see that it doth please God, that our boat leveth in the sea, and it may please God that some of us may come to the land if our boat were not overladen. Let us make 16 lots, and those 4 that have the 4 shortest lots we will cast overboard, preserving the master among us all. I replied unto him, saying, No, we will live and die together. Master Headley asked me if my remembrance were good. I answered, I gave God praise it was good, and knew how fair I was off the land, and was in hope to come to the landy within 2 or 3 days. And say they were but 60 leagues from the land, when there were 70 all to put them in comfort. Thus we continued the 3rd and 4th day, without any sustenance, save only the weeds that swam in the sea, and salt water to drinky. The 5th day Headley died, and another moreover than we desired all to die for in all these 5 days and 5 nights. We saw the sun but once and the star but one night, it was so foul weather. Thus we did remain the 6th day, then we were very weak, and wished all to die saving only myself, which did comfort them, and promised they should come soon to landy by the help of God, but the company were very importunate, and were in doubt they should ever come to land. But that I promised them the 7th day they should come to shore, or else they should cast me overboard, which did happen true the 7th day. For at 11 of the clock we had sight of the land, and 7 days and 7 nights the wind kept continually south. If the wind had in the meantime shifted upon any other point, we had never come to land. We were no sooner come to land, but the wind came clean contrary at north within half an hour after our arrival. But we were so weak that one could scarcely help another of us out of the boat. Yet with much ado being come all on shore, we kneeled down upon our knees, and gave God praise that he had dealt so mercifully with us. Afterwards those which were strongest holp their fellows unto a fresh brook, where we satisfied ourselves with water and berries very well. There were all sorts of berries plenty. As goodly a country as ever I saw, we found a very fair plain champion ground, that a man might see very fairer, every way by the seaside was here and there a little wood with goodly trees as good as ever I saw any in Norway, able to mast any shippy, of pine trees, spruce trees, fir, and very great birch trees. Where we came on land, we made a little house with boas, where we rested all that night. In the morning I divided the company 3 and 3 to go every way to see what good they could find to sustain themselves, and appointed them to meet, and there again at noon with such food as they could. Yet, as we went aboard, we found great store of reason as good as any we have in England a man. Would think ye they had been sowed there. We rested there 3 days and 3 nights, and lived very well. With peas and berries, we named the place St. Lawrence in Canada, and we found it very full of salmons. When we had well rested ourselves, we rowed our boat along the shore, thinking to have unto the Grand Bay to have come home with some Spaniards which are yearly there to kill the whale, and when we were hungry or athirst, we put our boat on land and gathered peas and berries. Thus we rowed our boat along the shore 5 days, about which time we came to a very goodly river that ran far up into the country, and saw very goodly growing trees of all sorties. There we happened upon a ship of St. John de Luz, which ship brought us into Biscay to an harbor called the Passage. The master of the shippy was our great friend, or else we had been put to death if he had not kept our counsel. For when the visitors came aboard, as it is the order in Spain, they demanding what we were, he said we were poor fishermen that had cast away our ship in Newfoundland, and so the visitors inquired no more of the matter at that time. As soon as night was come, he put us on land and bade us shift for ourselves. Then had we but 10 or 12 miles into France, which we went that night, and then cared not for the Spaniard. And so shortly after we came into England toward the end of the year 1583. It should be noted, in relation to Clark's defense of himself in the loss of the Delight, that Hakluyt says, in a marginal note, herein Clark untruly chargeth Sir Humphrey Gilbert W.G. Gosling, in his Life of Sir Humphrey Gilbert, adds that the discovery of their danger was first made by the Golden Hind, although a considerable distance in the wake of the Delight. Is condemnation sufficient of Clark? It has not been universally accepted that the St. Lawrence named by Clark was in fact the St. Lawrence of today. Howley, in a series of articles called Newfoundland Name Lore, quotes a lecture on Placentia Bay delivered in 1910 by H.W. Le Mesurier. The harbor of St. Lawrence is one of the prettiest and most frequented harbors on the peninsula, and was no doubt named by a Jerseyman. According to old charts, what is now called Lt. St. Lawrence was evidently the place first named St. Lawrence, and here was situated, from the earliest times of occupation, a Jersey room. The Nicolls held it for centuries and sold it to Newman Co. early in the 19th century. In a footnote, Howley tells us there is no vestige of this room now visible, and only 3 or 4 houses remain standing there. A few years ago, a very extensive whaling plant was established there under the management of Mr. Rismuller, but that also has been recently abandoned. This plant may have belonged to Newman Co., who were established in Little St. Lawrence, and who were at one time in the whaling business, but Peter J. Cashin, who found Mr. Rismuller operating a whaling plant at Naden Harbor, British Columbia in 1912, tells us in his memoirs that Rismuller had lived in Newfoundland and had been interested with Harvey Company in the whaling business. In an article in the Geographical Review DC, 1916, Viol. I entitled The Early Relations Between Newfoundland and the Channel Islands. Le Mesurier, whose own ancestral roots were in the Channel Islands, gives in a footnote the following definition of a fishing room. A fishing room consisted of owner's or agent's house, shop, or store warehouse for storing fish. Cookroom, a building in which the shoremen, that is the laboring men working on shore at the curing and shipping of fish, lived. Cooperage, forged sail and net lofts, stages, or places in which the fish was landed, split, and placed in salt flakes, erections on which the fish was spread to be dried after being in salt for a certain time, etc. In the same article, Mr. Le Mesurier gives his arguments for Jerseymen having named not only St. Lawrence but numerous towns and settlements in Newfoundland. On the northeast coast of the island of Jersey there are three places lying near each other and in the order named viz. St. John's Bay, Petit Port, and Bully Bay. Can it be mere coincidence that in Newfoundland we have St. John's Bay, wherein the harbor of St. John's is situated, Petty Harbor, and Bay Bulls, formerly written Bully Bay, and so appearing on the old charts, all contiguous and following in the same order as the Jersey places? I submit that this evidence is strong enough to warrant the opinion of Channel Islanders that A. Jerseymen named these three places St. John's, Petty Harbor, and Bully Bay. Jersey is divided into 12 parishes, viz. St. Owens, St. Peter's St. Burlade St. Lawrence St. Lawrence St. Mary's St. John's St. Hillier's Trinity St. Martin's St. Saviour's Grouville and St. Clements. Many of these names are prominent in Newfoundland, such as St. Mary's St. Mary's Bay St. Lawrence St. John's St. John's Bay, Trinity, and Trinity Bay. It may be said that these names were universally used by French, Spanish, and Portuguese discoverers in naming the new places that they found, but I am strongly of opinion that surrounding circumstances and early occupation by Channel Islanders prove that the names originated with them. On the west of Newfoundland, there are many more Channel Island names among the inhabitants. St. Mary's Bay, Cape St. Mary's Bay, Marion Harbor, and Collinet are names peculiar to Jersey. The Nichols of Jersey, early in the history of Newfoundland, had a fishing establishment at St. Mary's Harbor. St. Mary's was probably named by them after the parish of St. Mary in Jersey, and the bay in which the harbor was situated, and the cape at its W. Entrance took their names from that of the principal harbor. The E. Entrance to this bay, there are two places now called St. Shots and St. Shores, which formerly were named St. Jacques and St. George. The French pronunciation of these two names is responsible for the corruption. These 2 points might have been named by the French, but it is not likely that they would have called a place after the patron saint of England, whereas the Channel Islanders would. In Placentia Bay at Placentia, the old French capital, the Villeneuves of Jersey had a fishing establishment long before the French occupation. From that they moved to Burin and established a business which was continued uninterruptedly by Jersey firms until a few years ago. Marquise, between Placentia and Argentia, is probably named from La Marquise in Guernsey. On the west side of Placentia Bay we have Paradise from Paradis on the Guernsey coast, Petit Port from the same source. Jersey Island lies outside of Rochun and Bain Harbor. Crony Island off Beau Bois is Gros Nez. In Burin, at the entrance to the cove where the Jersey premises are situated, lies an island known to past generations as Villeneuve. After the Jersey family which removed from Placentia about 1680, Corbin Island and Barber a few miles SW of Burin bear a well-known Jersey and Guernsey name, at Little St. Lawrence. The Jersey firm of de Grouchy, Nicol Co. had a thriving establishment. A drawing of the island, in which the principal buildings were established, appears in the diary of the Duke of Clarence, afterwards William IV, who visited this place in HMS Pegasus in 1786. St. Lawrence was probably named after the parish of St. Lawrence in Jersey. Whether we accept Le Mesurier's argument for Jerseymen having named St. Lawrence, or we assume that Richard Clark's account does, indeed, refer to the St. Lawrence of today, it is a fact that the Clark family now residing in Little St. Lawrence claimed to be descended from him, and each generation of that family has had 1 or 2 Richard Clarks in his honor. Obviously, Clark did not establish a family in Newfoundland during his 1583 voyage, but there is evidence that he later returned to Newfoundland waters. For instance, Henry Kirke, in his The First English Conquest of Canada, says, "A curious narrative may be read, detailing an act of piracy committed by 3 French ships off Newfoundland in the year 1596 upon one Richard Clark." According to this account, Clark, by a ruse, was taken captive by the French, but was later released unharmed. Although references to St. Lawrence, Great Saint, Lawrence, and Little Saint Lawrence are few and far between, especially for the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. It is clear from these scattered references that St. Lawrence enjoyed some considerable importance among the fishermen of several nations. The ship of St. John de Luz, which Clark and his men happened upon, was undoubtedly a Basque ship, St. Jean de Luz having been one of the principal Basque ports. We know, of course, that the Basques were in Newfoundland waters much earlier. J.D. Rogers, in his A Historical Geography of the British Colonies v. 5 pt. 4 Newfoundland, suggests that the Basques were probably in these waters at least as early as 1530. He goes on to say of the Basques that they were usually found in the company of French or Portuguese. Thus, in 1583, out of 36 ships at St. John's, there were 20 Spanish and Portuguese ships, and 10 years later, i.e., 1593, according to the accounts of English privateer. Many Basque ships from France and Spain ... were busily employed in catching cod, whale, and walrus on the south coasts of Newfoundland ... and there was a large fleet of over 60 Basque ships in Placentia Bay. If Clark's landfall was at or near present-day St. Lawrence, this would put the Basques in the area at least 10 years earlier than Rogers indicates. Rogers goes on to say the most westerly fishing stations on the south coast, of which we hear from English sources, were first the bay, possibly White Bear Bay, where a French vessel saved Hoare in 1536, next Little and Great St. Lawrence, at the foot of the promontory between Fortune and Placentia Bays. 1597, then St. Pierre Island 1594, then Placentia Bay, where the big Basque fleet assembled in 1594, and lastly Cape St. Mary, which divides Placentia from St. Mary's Bay, and at all these stations no other ships except Basque or French ships were seen. This unwilling evidence by 3 or 4 isolated Englishmen as to French predominance on the south coast, and more especially in Placentia Bay, is only less remarkable than their eloquent silence as to the existence of any single Englishman in those parts. In his Ecclesiastical History of Newfoundland, Howley says the earliest map I know of which gives the name of St. Lawrence C. D.S. Lorenza is Jacob says' map of the year 1621. After that it appears on all the maps extant. Of course, there are extant numerous maps of the 17th and 18th centuries which do not show St. Lawrence, but there are also earlier maps of which Howley seems not to have known which do show St. Lawrence. Howley himself tells us in a map, painted by Varese, upon the walls of the Vatican Palace, Rome, in the Loggia di Raphael, about the year 1556. The southern part of Labrador is called Terra di Cortorial. Henry Harris, in his Découvertes et Evolution Cartographique de Terre Neuve, says that Varese finished his mural from 28 December 1559 to 25 December 1561. He further says that nothing could be more primitive and inexact than Varese's delineation of Newfoundland. Rien de plus primitivité de moins exact que sa delineation de Terre Neuve along the coast, which resembles nothing, is a group of 9 little islands, and the meager nomenclature ... which includes C. Lorenzo, et la langue de ce littoral qui ne ressemble à rien, un chapelet de 9 petites îles et la maigre nomenclature. Although it is impossible to be sure on such a wildly inaccurate map, it may be that Varese is C. Lorenzo is St. Lawrence. John Dee's map of 1578 to 1580 drawn by Simon Fernandez, which may be derived from Varese, clearly shows A.S. Lawrence, which one speculates may be intended to represent St. Lawrence. It occurs on that shore which resembles nothing to the northwest of the unresolved western and northern side of the group of 9 islands. The delineation of Newfoundland as a group of islands Fabien Ooeaa tells us in his essay, The 17th Century Cartography of Newfoundland had become standard in the 16th century, once the voyages of Cartier had detached the area from the mainland. Ooeaa in this same essay gives us a reproduction of the 1598 map of Terra Nova drawn by Barent Langenes and Cornelius Claes, which includes in its nomenclature S. Lawrence, which almost certainly is the St. Lawrence of today. Thus it is sure that St. Lawrence appeared on maps prior to 1621, and it is possible that it may have appeared even before Clark's ill-fated voyage of 1583. C. Grant Head, in 18th century Newfoundland, indicates French activity at St. Lawrence, on the coast of Chapeau Rouge, as this coast was known, in 1640. Prowse says that in 1676 the French fished at St. Mary's, Coronet, Colonnet Island, St. Peter's, Great and Little St. Lawrence, 3 islands, Petite Nord, and several places west besides Placentia, are their chief place. All other places mentioned are merely resorted to by the ship fishermen from France for the fishing season and were abandoned in the autumn. The next specifically dated reference we have to Saint Lawrence is at the beginning of the War of the Spanish Succession, Queen Anne's War, and here we shall quote Stephen Martin Leake's biography of his uncle, Sir John Leake, which went through 3 editions between 1726 and 1793. Leake, on the 18th of June 1702, was informed that he had been appointed degree of north latitude, but not so valuable in itself, as for the extraordinary fishing carried on upon the shoals or banks contiguous to it, and from thence. Called the banks of Newfoundland, the island being of little use but to prepare and dry the fish upon, and to afford harbors for the shipping, which assemble there in great numbers at the fishing season. By the time Leake sailed for Newfoundland, he had likewise a commission appointing him governor of the island, and commander-in-chief of the land forces, during the time he should be at Newfoundland. For the commander-in-chief of the king's ships at that place is always governor of the island. Whilst he is there, Leake left England on the 25th of July, and on the 26th of August. In the morning they discovered the land, and the next day, in the morning, were off the Bay of Bulls. Soon after, Captain Studley, the admiral of that harbor, came on board the Commodore, by whom Leake was informed that there were 2 ships loading at Trepassy, and 2 other French ships of war at Placentia, and that most of their fishing vessels, which had made their voyages, were gone thither for convoy, that the French kept men upon the hills, over the Bay of Bulls, who, upon the arrival of any ships, immediately retired to give notice to them at Placentia, to which place it was about 3 days' journey. Upon this intelligence, without staying to anchor, Commodore Leake proceeded that very evening to the southward of Placentia Bay. The 28th he took a small ship from Martinique bound to Placentia, and soon after, seeing 4 sail off Cape Pine, he ordered the Montagu and Litchfield to chase them, whilst himself plied in for Trepassy, where he saw 2 French ships, which about noon he took. In the afternoon he stood out of Trepassy, and was joined at night by the Litchfield with 2 of the 4 French ships he had chased. The 29th in the morning, off of St. Mary's, he chased a French flyboat, which he bore away for St. Mary's, and at noon was joined by the Montagu with 3 French prizes and galley for Colonnet Bay, 3 leagues from St. Mary's. Himself with the rest of the squadron stood away for St. Mary's, where he anchored in the afternoon, and found a French flyboat, which upon his approach, the enemy run ashore. Hereupon the Commodore ordered all the boats manned and armed to attempt to get her off, which with some difficulty they performed. Soon after landing their men, they drove the French from the place, burning and destroying all the houses, together with all their stages for building ships, all their shallops and boats, some vessels that were already built, and others near finished, with everything belonging to them. And having entirely destroyed that settlement, he left the place at night, leaving the assistants and Charles Galley to proceed with the prizes to St. John's. The next day he took a French flyboat in Colonnet Bay, and having landed his men at Colonnet, he entirely destroyed it, as he had done to that of Trepassy. His prize he dispatched under the same convoy as the former prizes at St. Mary's, with orders to those 2 commanders, when they had seen the prizes into St. John's, to cruise off Cape Race and the banks for 14 days. With the rest of the squadron he proceeded towards St. Lawrence and the island of St. Peter's, both of them very considerable settlements of the French at the entrance of Fortune Bay. Being off of St. Lawrence he discovered 3 sail, whereupon he left the Montagu in Medway to endeavor to get them out and then to follow him to St. Peter's. The 1st of September, in the morning he was fair in with St. Peter's with an intention of going into that harbor, but it blowing hard and likely to be bad weather, that it would be difficult to ride with a spring upon a cable, if they should meet with any opposition, as also a narrow harbor, and the ground without it very broken, that the least miscarriage in anchoring might endanger them. The Commodore thought it advisable not to attempt going in till fairer weather. Accordingly he stood off from the shore, but by good fortune, next morning, there being a fine breeze, they made in for the harbor, as they thought, and saw 8 ships and small vessels off of the easternmost point of the island, to which giving chase. They found the pilot had been under a mistake, for the Commodore discovered the harbor was on that side, and in it 7 or 8 ships at anchor. So had the weather been proper, and he had borne away the morning before for the place the pilots had always taken for the entrance of the harbor, he would not only have run the hazard of being driven to leeward of the island, but also of falling on a ledge of rocks, which lay off the westernmost end of the island. At noon he took one of the ships, laden with fish, and leaving the Litchfield in chase of another, himself tacked and plied in for the harbor, to secure the rest. But when he was within a quarter of a mile of the entrance, he discovered 4 sail, endeavoring to make their escape from the South Channel, which the pilots had affirmed to him was not navigable for any vessel that drew above 5 or 6 feet water. And observing that the rest loosed their topsails to go out the same way, he concluded they were very small ships, and thought it to no purpose to chase them, for it was then about 7 at night, and the wind right out of the harbor, which was not above half a mile over, and a dangerous rock in the middle of it, which appeared a very little above water, so that there was no attempting to turn in. Whereupon he drove under his topsails till it was dark, the better to amuse the enemy. But his real design was to stand for the South Channel to intercept them, had not the haziness of the weather prevented him, by which means they escaped, except one laden with salt, taken by the Litchfield. In the morning he plied in for the shore to look into the harbor, and by 4 in the afternoon was within 1.5 leagues of it, but only the enemy's ships being got out of the harbor, he bore up to join the Litchfield, which he did in the evening. He kept plying to windward with an easy sail all night, and in the morning, being the 4th of September, he bore away for St. Lawrence to join the Montagu in Medway, of whose safety he was in some doubt, not having heard from them in all this time. At 11 o'clock he joined the former, who acquainted him that he parted from the Medway the night before, who was gone with 4 prizes to St. John's, 2 of which were part of them that escaped from St. Peter's, and the other 2 were taken at Great St. Lawrence that they likewise burnt 2 sail at Little St. Lawrence, and destroyed all the houses, boats, stages, at both those places, where they had been detained by contrary winds, which was the reason they had not joined him before. It was then agreed to bear away for St. John's in order to go to Chapeau Rouge on the north part of Newfoundland. Leake returned to England on the 10th of November. Martin Leake summarizes his voyage as follows. In this expedition 51 ships were taken and destroyed, whereof 29 were taken amounting to 3,235 tons and 207 guns, and of them 16 were brought to England, 6 were sent to Lisbon, 5 sold at St. John's, one of 120 tons and 12 guns, was left there for the security of the harbor, and the others sent to France with the prisoners. The remainder, to the number of 22, were burnt with their cargoes as well. As a great part of the cargoes of those that escaped, who were glad to get away half-loaded, or anyhow to avoid. The fate of the rest, besides the burning and destroying Trepassy, St. Mary's, Collionet, Great and Little St. Lawrence and St. Peter's, all very considerable settlements of the French at Newfoundland, and of the greatest importance for carrying on their fishery in those parts, and breeding of seamen. Upon his return to England, Leake was offered a knighthood, which modesty or delicacy he declined. One notices that in all of this there is no mention of Channel Islanders. The Channel Islands are, of course, the only French-speaking European islands belonging to England. As noted earlier, Le Mesurier, in his lecture on Placentia Bay, says here Little St. Lawrence was situated from the very earliest times of occupation a Jersey room. The Nichols held it for centuries and sold the property to Newman Co. early in the 19th century. He also says Jersey houses had been early in St. Lawrence, Burin, Mortier, Little Placentia, and were in some cases in existence at the time of the French occupation of Placentia. We cannot be sure, not having specific dates for the Nicol & Co. Involvement, as R. Omer notes in her thesis, the history of the company has not yet been written, but if Le Mesurier is correct, we can assume that a lot of Jersey property went up in smoke along with that of the French. J.D. B. Rogers cites Captain William Taverner as having surveyed, in 1717 to 1718, all the French coastline, with its 50-odd coves and creeks from Cape St. Mary to Chapeau Rouge, and from Chapeau Rouge to the westernmost tenements in or near Hermitage Bay, and if Placentia and St. Pierre were accepted. He had found only a few settlers at Boboy near Burin and 6 or 7 elsewhere. Rogers footnote Maricon Island, Ageron Island, Boboy, Corbine, Little St. Lawrence, in Placentia Bay West Coast Beach, near Fortune and Bandalore Belliorum, where Belorme had wintered 20 years. End footnote. And rather more than twice that number of vacant houses. Again, one wonders where the Jerseymen were. As Le Mesurier reminds us, in 1713, by the terms of the Treaty of Utrecht, all the French settlements were yielded to England, and Placentia from thenceforth became an English possession. the French harbors in Placentia Bay. Mentioned by La Hontan, to which the French resorted, were Little and Great Burin Saint, Lawrence, Mortier, and Cape Chapeau Rouge. La Hontan says, according to Rogers, that French Biscayan fishermen visited but never settled in Little Burin, Great Burin, Martyr Saint, Lawrence, and Chapeau Rouge on the western extremity of Placentia Bay. Le Mesurier goes on to say that after the Treaty of Utrecht, mercantile houses commenced to flourish in the bay. The first major spread of settlement along the south coast, according to Keith Matthews, A History of the West of England Newfoundland Fishery, was recorded in the Fishery Return for 1763, the year the 7 Years' War ended, and St. Lawrence was among those places settled. In 1765, Captain James Cook began his survey of the region. William Whiteley, in James Cook in Newfoundland, 1762 to 1767, says that in the 1765 season, 4 pilots were engaged at 4 shillings a day each, John Beck for the coast west of Great St. Lawrence, Morgan Snook for Fortune Bay, John Dawson for Conager and Hermitage Bays, and John Peck for the Bay of Despair. Whiteley goes on to say that James Cook investigated particularly thoroughly the present and possible future fisheries on the south coast adjacent to St. Pierre and Miquelon. His massive chart of that coast is drawn on a scale of 1 inch to the mile, with insets of 8 major harbors, on a scale of 3 inches to the mile. Cook depicts in the various harbors stages for the splitting of fish, marked in red, and convenient places for the building of stages for the landing and drying of fish, marked in yellow. 40 stages in current use are identified, scattered among 11 harbors. In addition, there are some 20 places marked as suitable for new stages in these same harbors, which include Great St. Lawrence on the Burin Peninsula. Cook's directions for navigating on part of the south coast of Newfoundland, 1766, describes the environs of St. Lawrence as follows. Cape Chapeau Rouge, or the Mountain of the Red Hat, is situated on the west side of Placentia Bay, in the latitude of 46°53 north, and lies nearly west 17 or 18 leagues from Cape St. Mary's. It is the highest and most remarkable land on that part of the coast, appearing above the rest something like the crown of a hat, and may be seen in clear weather 12 leagues. Close to the eastward of Cape Chapeau Rouge are the harbors of Great and Little St. Lawrence. To sail into Great St. Lawrence, which is the westernmost, there is no danger but what lies very near the shore, taking care with westerly, and particularly S.W. winds, not to come too near the Hat Mountain, to avoid the flurries and eddy winds under the high land. The course in is first on, till you open the upper part of the harbor, the NNW, half W. The best place for great ships to anchor, and the best ground is before a cove on the east side of the harbor in 13-fathom water. A little above Blue Beach Point, which is the first point on the west side. Here you lie, only 2 points open. You may anchor anywhere between this point and the point of Low Beach, on the same side near the head of the harbor, observing that close to the west shore. The ground is not so good as on the other side. Fishing vessels lay at the head of the harbor above the beach, sheltered from all winds, to sail into Little St. Lawrence, you must keep the west shore on board, in order to avoid a sunken rock which lies a little without the point of the peninsula, which stretches off from the east side of the harbor. You anchor above this peninsula, which covers you from the sea winds in 3 and 4 fathom water. A fine sandy bottom. In these harbors are good fishing conveniences and plenty of wood and water. Ships may anchor without the peninsula in fathom good ground, but open to the SSW winds. Soccer Head lies 3 miles to the eastward of Cape Chapeau Rouge. It is a pretty high round point, off which lie some sunken rocks about a cable's length from the shore. This garden bank, whereon is from 7 to 17 fathom water, lies about half a mile off from Little St. Lawrence, with Blue Beach Point on, with the east point on, with the east point of Great St. Lawrence. Ferryland Head lies SW 1 mile from Cape Chapeau Rouge. It is a high rocky island, just separated from the mainnet, and Cape Chapeau Rouge are sufficient marks to know the harbors of St. Lawrence. Cape Chapeau Rouge, or the Red Hat Mountain, was described as follows in the Newfoundland Journal. Chapeau Rouge is the most remarkable cape in all Newfoundland, an immense heap of ragged, craggy rocks, placed one upon the other. Viewed from the sea, every fathom of your move gives it a new shape. The most striking appearance when fog is hovering over it. It appears like a Dutchman without legs, a hat, a lion rampant, a bust, a broken turret, and lastly a broken, irregular, craggy, inaccessible mountain. This cape is the southern angle of GT. St. Lawrence's Harbor. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, there was a great deal of activity by pirates, privateers, and smugglers in the waters off the south coast of Newfoundland. Prowse, in his history, quotes a letter to Governor Admiral Sir Hugh Palliser, dated at Great St. Lawrence Harbor, July 8, 1765, relating to the capture of 3 American smugglers. Sir, I have sent to St. John's 3 New England schooners seized by Lyant. A. Dixon, commander of Her Majesty's Scow Edgemont in St. Pierre Road. Such vessels are wanted for the fishery. The vessels are the Industrious Pretence belonging to Cape Ann, the Robin Hood belonging to the same place, and the Industry from Marblehead. The depredations of American privateers or pirates were particularly devastating in the periods of the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Head, in his 18th century Newfoundland, says, "The summer of 1776 saw the Americans hovering off the coast, plundering and capturing some of the banking vessels and taking several of the market-bound ships. In 1778, it was reported that ships had been cut out of various Newfoundland harbors by American privateers, and the fishery on the south coast and at Labrador had been either destroyed or heavily disturbed by them." He goes on, "But although the residents were not as likely as were banking men to clash with American privateers, they felt the effects of the Revolution quite as severely. 175 trading ships from the northern colonies had brought foodstuffs in 1774. The next year there were only 66, and in 1776 there were only 3. From then until the end of the war, the official statistics record none. Toward the end of the 18th century, Placentia, which had been the capital of the south coast, began to decline in importance." Head tells us that Placentia was noted as a magazine of stores and provisions in 1772, but little was said of it thereafter. At that time, Placentia had supplied its whole bay and other coves further to the westward. By 1807, it was still probably the bay's distributing center for bread and flour, but in most other major imports, the port of Burin had drawn ahead. This latter port brought in half again as much salt meat, almost all the rum and molasses, and twice as much salt, as did the old capital of the bay. Head goes on to quote Governor Gower. "As a fishing harbor, Placentia, though formerly considerable, had greatly declined, there being but one mercantile house established in it, and not more than 6 or 8 vessels annually loaded there, while at Burin, Mortier, St. Lawrence, and other harbors on the western shore of Placentia Bay, a considerable number of merchants and planters are settled, who carry on the principal part of the fishery of the district." We noted earlier Le Messurier's statement that the Jersey House of Nicole had been established there from the earliest times. He further says that at St. Lawrence they did an extensive business in connection with their other establishment further west, probably at Gultois. Nicole Co., Le Messurier says, sold out to Newman Co. In the early 19th century, Newman Co., now thought of principally in relation to Newman's Port, established itself in St. Lawrence, according to John Dallemont in his History of Fortune Bay, in the years 1786-88. They were involved in the seal fishery, whaling, and the cod fishery. Wayfarer, writing in the St. John's Daily News Deck, 1954, mentions 2 incidents concerning the Newman operation at St. Lawrence. 2 macabre notes are found in the records of 1835. One concerns a member of the Newman staff at the plantation at St. Lawrence. The man died and his body was sent home, preserved in a rum puncheon. This, however, had been common practice for many years when bodies had to be transported. The other incident was the discovery of a colored child in a puncheon of molasses received from the West Indies. Almost enough to put one off rum and molasses. Prowse gives information about Newman ships taken by French and American privateers during the War of 1812, but he does not mention the home ports of these vessels. The notes on the vessel St. Lawrence are of interest, not only because of the name, but also as being indicative of the sorts of dangers Newfoundland shipping underwent at the time. In 1813. The St. Lawrence boarded by an American privateer who plundered, destroyed, and disabled the vessel in every way possible, flinging overboard the cargo. She bore up for Dartmouth, arriving 10th April, 13th Aug. 1814. The St. Lawrence, on her passage to Bilbao with a cargo of fish, was captured by an American privateer, recaptured by a British frigate, and again captured by another American privateer, the Whig, and sent to America, recaptured again by the English and sent to Portsmouth. Prowse gives two other stories of privateering on the Newfoundland coast, for which he says he is indebted to his friend, Mr. Robert Pike of St. Lawrence. In 1813, an Irish youngster ran away from his master, Mr. Bonnell in St. Lawrence, and went to Lawn, found an American privateer there, went on board of her, and joined the crew. He came down to Great St. Lawrence with the Americans and captured a Jersey brig belonging to a firm of 3 brothers, then carrying on a trade there. The privateer was commanded by a little Irishman named Connolly. She was afterwards captured in the passage between Columbia and St. Pierre, known as Hell's Mouth by H&M Cutter Lichter, under command of Lieut. McKillop, R.N. The privateer got in the doldrums becalmed there and surrendered without a fight. In the last French war, before the Battle of Waterloo, Mr. Henry Beck, an old Englishman, ancestor of the Becks of St. Lawrence, had his fishing skiff armed. In the spring of 1814, he captured a large French banker by boarding her and driving the crew off the deck. He was taking his prize into Harbor Breton. It was a fine day. The French cook was in the galley getting dinner for all hands. An altercation took place between one of Beck's fishermen and the cook as the vessel was passing Little Cape. The cook threw the contents of the frying pan into the Englishman's face, blinding him. This was a preconcerted signal agreed on among the French crew. They seized Beck's men and threw Beck into the hold, breaking his bones. He died soon after. The Frenchman took the banker to Boston, U.S., where the St. Lawrence men were kept prisoners until the autumn, when they returned home. This was, however, a comparatively short war, and when it ended, the people were able to devote themselves to the serious business of getting a living and improving the quality of their lives. We are told that the first school in St. Lawrence was established in 1817 with a teacher, William Tuck, who was charged with expanding the minds of 30 pupils. It is not known how long this school lasted, but the census of 1836 indicates that there were no schools at that time. The 1836 census gives a denominational breakdown for the inhabitants of Little and Great St. Lawrence. At Little St. Lawrence, there were 53 Roman Catholics and 8 Protestant dissenters. At Great St. Lawrence were 178 Roman Catholics, Protestant Episcopalians, and Protestant dissenters. Howley, in his Ecclesiastical History, quotes the RT. Rev. Dr. M.A. Fleming's visitations relative to his 1835 visit to Great St. Lawrence. August 18th set sail for Cape Chapeau Rouge and entered the harbor of Great St. Lawrence the same evening, and as a practicable pathway runs from Great St. Lawrence to Little St. Lawrence, the people of the latter place were soon advertised of our coming as it developed. Rev. Fleming was a little premature as concerns the notification of the faithful of Little St. Lawrence. He later learned that his messenger had not left Great St. Lawrence, and so had to proceed without the Little St. Lawrence portion of his flock. However, on Thursday the 24th, I had the satisfaction of administering confirmation to 65 persons, a majority of whom were converts and the children of converts to the faith. On the political scene there was activity in the early 1830s, but exactly what effect this had on St. Lawrence is not clear. The first Newfoundland House of Assembly sat in 1832, with Mr. William Hooper representing the district of Burin, which included Great and Little St. Lawrence. As momentous as this no doubt was, one suspects that the inhabitants of St. Lawrence concerned themselves with politics only when the politicians meddled in the fishery. Rogers, in his Historical Geography, tells us something of Burin in this period, and there is no doubts that St. Lawrence was affected by the events and conditions described. In 1818, Burin was but little known. In 1832, it became the capital of an electoral district which was created at the foot of the promontory between Placentia Bay and Fortune Bay, and in 1741 its shipping was 4 times as much as that of Placentia. The new influence which made men drift westward, against the stream and with the sun, was St. Pierre, which was now the baiting place of the big bounty-fed bankers of old France. The old French capital was being eclipsed by the new French capital. In 1854, 296 French bankers made St. Pierre their rendezvous, and bought from the boatmen of Burin and Fortune Bay PS 56,000 worth of herring and caplin. Jukes 1839, Locke 1848, and Canning 1854 denounced the anti-patriotism of the sellers' bait sales to foreigners were forbidden by English acts which were unrepealed though forgotten, and export duties on bait were imposed by a local act of 1836 which no one enforced. Denunciations, prohibitions, and penalties were words, idle words, but a market where PS 56,000 a year could be won was a living magnetic force. Accordingly, in 1854, Governor Kerr Bailey Hamilton, backed by his Solicitor General, introduced a bill which would have effectually prevented bait sales to foreigners. Hardly had he done so when a magician appeared upon the scenes and muttered a formula. There was a sudden revulsion of sentiment. Things which had been blamed as secret vices were praised as public virtues, and even the ineffectual law of 1836 was repealed. The magician was the United States, the conjurer who raised him was Canada, the formula was a treaty. And the word in the treaty which stilled the storm was the word cod. Negotiations with the United States for the purpose of explaining and expanding the Treaty of 1818 had been suggested by Canada in 1847, and resulted in the Treaty of Washington, which was concluded by the Earl of Elgin on behalf of British North America in 1854. It was terminable after 10 years, and during its continuance Americans were admitted within the 3-mile limit of the British coasts of the Atlantic and the Gulf of St. Lawrence for purposes of sea fishing, and to the same shores for the purposes of curing and drying fish, but not so as to interfere with private property or British occupants, and British North Americans were admitted to analogous privileges on the seas and shores of New England. A postscript to the treaty admitted fish and fish oil free from the country of one into the country of another of contracting parties. To the Newfoundlander, fish meant cod. Cod fishing necessitated bait buying, and cod put bait bills out of the minds of Newfoundlanders for the 12 years during which the treaty lasted. Incidentally, the Jukes mentioned above, who deplored as anti-patriotic the selling of bait to the French, was a British geologist who visited St. Lawrence in 1839. Rogers speaks of bounty-fed bankers. Jukes makes clear the meaning of the term in his Excursions in Newfoundland, 1839 and 1840. A bounty of about 5 or 6 shillings per quintal is paid by the French government on all fish caught by their own fishermen. The French fishery is accordingly conducted on a very different plan from the present English fishery. Large vessels with regular crews are employed, every man is numbered, and a regular system adopted, both in the actual catching of the fish and in the curing it. These vessels fish mostly on the banks, far out of sight of land, and remain there till they have completed their cargo. The English fishery is, on the contrary, entirely uncontrolled and unstimulated by bounties. Every man catches fish for himself or for others, according to his inclination or his capital. He either hires himself out as a servant for regular wages or a share of the produce, or he builds himself a boat and catches what he can, selling the produce to his merchant, or whomsoever will purchase it. The English fishery is accordingly now essentially a shore fishery, and carried on by the regular inhabitants from their own doors, as it were. As might easily be supposed from these circumstances, occasional squabbles occur on the shores in the neighborhood of St. Peter's, sometimes between the French and English fishermen, and sometimes between their masters and authorities. The French are frequently in want of bait, more especially of caplin in the caplin season they are apt, therefore, to run over to the English shore with a fast boat and a few nets, and help themselves to a little of it. This the majority of the English settlers of course disapprove of, as depriving them of their natural advantages. There are not wanting, however, some of them who for the sake of profit will undertake to supply the French with caplin of their own catching. And this leads to dissensions among themselves. Again, many of the French fishermen are willing to buy codfish, either cured or uncured, from the English, in order to get the bounty on it from their own government. This the French authorities naturally oppose and enforce stringent regulations against the English fishermen. The English custom house officers moreover look on St. Pierre as a nest of smugglers, or at least as a constant source of temptation for the English settlers to become smugglers, in which, by the way, they are not far wrong. On this smuggling trade neither the custom house officers nor the respectable merchants look with favorable eyes. For all these reasons, the presence of a man of war of each nation some time during the fishing season is absolutely necessary, and without the salutary fear of such visits the mutual jealousy would perhaps find vent in actual outbreaks and open quarrels. As it is, however, a tolerably good understanding seems to be kept up, more especially among the lower orders of each nation, who probably find their account in it. From St. Pierre Jukes sailed to St. Lawrence. October 11th. After several shifts and changes, the wind this afternoon settled into a pleasant breeze from the west. We accordingly set sail, having Mr. R. Thorne, who lived at St. Lawrence, as a passenger. At 10:00 p.m., we were off Cape Chapeau Rouge, immediately to the east of which are two small inlets called Great and Little St. Lawrence. We accordingly stood in, but it was so dark we could not make out the entrance at first, and at last got into Great St. Lawrence, instead of the other inlet, in which was Mr. Thorne's residence. October 12th to 16th. We were again detained at St. Lawrence during this time by a succession of contrary winds, during which I was hospitably entertained by Mr. J.T. and his lady, who reside at Little St. Lawrence, together with two younger brothers. Their house is very prettily situated on a small peninsula, jutting into the inlet, and connected with the main by a pebble beach. This beach is evidently of recent formation, being thrown up by the indraught of the tide during the southwest gales, and the peninsula was once an island. One day one of the men came across to me from Great St. Lawrence with intelligence that a lead vein had been discovered. On going over, I found quite an excitement, and at least 20 people hammering and digging at the rock. The rock itself was a kind of sienite, consisting principally of red feldspar with interspersed crystals of quartz. A vein 2 or 3 inches wide was in one part filled with small crystals of fluid of lime, and among these were some little cubical crystals of galena, and a coating of a greenish hue that might be green carbonate of copper. To satisfy the people, I had a good deal of the rock pulled down, and the whole affair shortly ended, the vein closing and losing all its crystalline contents. It is just possible that more mineral veins and of better quality might be found in the neighborhood, but no other indications existed, and none appeared in the cliffs, while the interior of the country was covered with moss and wood. That Jukes spoke with the voice of prophecy became clear only later. Wendy Martin, in her chapter on St. Upon Amin, comments briefly on Lawrence and once early mining ventures in the area. Although original inhabitants of the St. Lawrence area undoubtedly noticed the many purple, yellow, green, and transparent fluorspar veins in the rocks surrounding their village, they would have had no more idea of the mineral's name than of its significance. More intriguing to people were the minor amounts of silver and lead ore embedded within the fluorspar vein. It was for these metals, rather than for fluorspar, that men first mined around St. Lawrence. Tradition holds that in the 17th or 18th century Spanish or Portuguese sailors drove and added into a fluorspar vein at Chambers Cove near St. Lawrence, and extracted the associated lead ore. A less romantic but equally plausible possibility is that men working for Charles Bennett mined at Chambers Cove around the time that they removed silver from Bennett's Mine Cove property 7 miles away at Lawn. One curious early mining attempt in the area happened sometime before 1825 northeast of St. Lawrence. Here, unidentified individuals sank a shaft on a lead-bearing fluorspar vein and left behind metal artifacts that were uncovered in 1933, when the vein, the Black Duck vein, became the site of Newfoundland's first fluorspar mine. It is interesting to note that in the 1949 order incorporating St. Lawrence as a town, we find the boundaries of the said municipality shall be as follows, beginning at the mouth of Pinnacle Brook and Chamber Cove, being the southeast angle of land described in a fee simple mining grant to Charles Fox Bennett. This reference to Bennett's claim as forming part of the boundary of the town was removed in an order dated August 22nd, 1950. Here we find the 3. Town of St. Lawrence order, dated the 14th day of November, A.D. 1949, is hereby amended by deleting the words "the southeast angle of land described in the fee simple mining grant to Charles Fox Bennett, the town of St. Lawrence. No. 1 Amendment Order, 1971 makes no reference to this mining claim. Anyway, mining is for later in our consideration of St. Lawrence. The first merchants in St. Lawrence were the Giovannini brothers, Gregory and Celestine, who migrated to St. Lawrence from Lucca, province of Tuscany, Italy, in 1860. The two brothers purchased land in St. Lawrence and opened for business. They dealt in foodstuffs, dry goods, fishing gear, and various other supplies needed at the time by the local people. These supplies were exchanged for fish, as well as cash. Produce for the store, cheese, potatoes, butter, and root crops, was shipped by coastal vessel from Prince Edward Island. St. Lawrence at that time had a population of 535, and being a fishing community, fish was, for them, both capital and currency. The Giovanninis enabled the fisherman to buy supplies, receive cash for his surplus catch, and also enjoy the convenience of disposing of his product without going outside the village. Before the Giovanninis, there were no merchants in the immediate area. According to the census of 1869, the nearest merchant was in Burin proper. Fishermen would deal with merchants in other areas who would come by vessel to collect their catch at specified times of the year. The fishermen were paid in kind, receiving supplies for their fish. The business begun by the Giovanni brothers was indeed a great convenience to the settlers of that period, and their business and the fishing industry progressed stride by stride together. Although there is probably no connection, other significant businesses at St. Lawrence were begun. Only after telegraphic communication, the first direct communication between St. Lawrence and the rest of Newfoundland and the outside world was extended to St. Lawrence in 1885. In 1898, a whaling factory was established in Little St. Lawrence by an American company. This factory was located on the west side of the harbor. The boss, Captain Lamarquel, had a house located next to the factory. The company employed 2 whaling vessels, each of which had 10 Norwegian crewmen. When coming in around Blow Me Down, the whalers would blow to alert the men at the factory of their catch. 3 blows for sulphur-bottom whales, 2 for humpback whales, and 1 blow for finback. The whales were laid out on the beach, and oil and fish meal were made from the remains. This factory employed 50 to 60 men at 17.2 per hour, good wages for those days. The produce of the factory was collected by steamers and sold abroad. In the early 1900s, there were 2 liver factories in St. Lawrence. One was owned by Fr. Thorne, P.P., the other, owned by Patrick Aylward, was situated near where Aylward's convenience store now stands. This factory was washed away by the tidal wave of 1929 and was relocated on nearby Kelly's Hill. Prior to the 1890s, fishing was done by the old-fashioned hook and line method or with nets or signs. The 1890s saw the advent of banking schooners. The first 2 schooners, the Ronald H. and the Klondike, were brought to St. Lawrence in 1893 by my grandfather, those Farrell. Each of these schooners carried 10 dories with 2 men per dory. The rest of the crew consisted of a cook, a mate, a captain, a catchee, and a boatswain. This type of fishing proved fairly successful. The turn of the century brought a number of changes to the fishing industry. Cod traps and decked sailing skiffs were introduced into the St. Lawrence fishery. These skiffs would fish up to 10 miles out. The trawl was also introduced at about this time. The trawl had a ground line which went down about 50 fathoms, or 300 feet. Attached to the ground line were said lines at intervals of 5 or 6 feet. On each said line was a hook baited with fish, usually herring in the spring, capelin in June and July, and squid in August and the fall. The trawl fishery was carried on both inshore and on the offshore banks. Until the tidal wave of 1929, an extensive trap fishery was carried on by those Farrell Sons, A.A., Giovannini, and Pike Bradley. All had general stores in the area and supplied those materials which were essential to the conduct of the fishery in the community. Actually, Pike Bradley sold out to W.T. Hollett of Burin sometime before 1929, and their premises were destroyed in the tidal wave. The A. Giovanni premises were situated on the site of today's K. Karen Motel. Bradley Pike was located on the east side, and T. Farrell Sons was located partly on the site of the present Farrell Bros. Premises and partly on waterfront property later purchased by Alkin. Because the 10A Giovannini boats were painted blue, they were referred to as the Blue Boats. T. Farrell Sons boats were white and carried yellow dories. The Farrells had 5 trap boats, plus a jack boat built in 1912 called the Pioneer. This was the first boat in St. Lawrence to be powered by an engine 14 HP. She was used in the coastal fishery and the offshore grounds. The Farrells also owned a larger, yacht-type vessel, which they had built in St. Lawrence for a New York millionaire, a Mr. J.B. Orr, who died before the boat was completed. It was an auxiliary with a 60 ft. Span, spacious, accommodations, and a 48 HP engine. Initially, this boat, called the Miowa, was used for pleasure and for aid excursions to St. Pierre and other points. Later they made changes in her, cutting down the accommodations and installing 2 smaller masts and a smaller engine 24 HP. Gray and used her for trading. Alexander Slaney, Charles Beck, John Beck, Victor Turpin, and Thomas Turpin also owned their own boats and equipment and carried on a successful trap fishery. During the 1920s, Victor Turpin and Thomas J. Turpin also established small general stores. The introduction of the gasoline engine in 1916 revolutionized the fishing industry in St. Lawrence. Prior to this, the larger vessels had been powered by sail and skiffs and dories by man-powered oars. The change to motor power gave fishermen the freedom to move out farther into the ocean in the search for fish. It also helped the offshore fishery by allowing the ships to arrive at the banks while their bait, which would be frozen, was still in good condition. Due to catch failures and other unfavorable conditions, St. Lawrence's bank fishery ceased, and in 1915 only the inshore fishery was pursued. St. Lawrence was one of the better locations on the south coast for the inshore fishery, and for a time it was quite successful. Fish was sold fresh, in salt bulk or sun-dried, and was exported direct to the various markets. This prosperous fishery was effectively ended in 1929. The tidal wave of that year had a devastating effect on the fishing grounds, and for 2 years after there was an almost complete absence of fish in local waters. The epicenter of the earthquake which caused the wave was less than 100 miles south of Cape Chapeau Rouge. It destroyed the plankton and the vegetation on the ocean floor on which the fish feed. This absence of fish and the generally unstable fish markets, plus the opening of the fluorspar mines in 1933, caused the people to turn their backs on the fishery. In the early 1940s, there was a small fishery carried on by some of the older men who were unable to find work in the mines, and in 1957, after the shutdown of the St. Lawrence Corporation, some of the younger men again became involved in the fishery and acquired boats and equipment. This was short-lived, however. Only a few continued to fish when work became available at the new fluor mines. Some miners did fish part-time, on days off and on holidays, since in 1958, it became possible for them to dispose of their fresh fish at the fishery products plant at Burin. The delivery of fresh fish to the facilities at Burin was facilitated by the building in 1959, through the combined efforts of the town council, the federal and provincial governments, and the Fishermen's Committee, of a community stage. The introduction of gill nets into our fishery in 1962 stepped up production considerably. The fishermen were no longer dependent on bait, which was sometimes difficult to procure. The first 5 or 6 years after the introduction of gill nets, catches were increased noticeably. Recently, however, there has been a serious decline in catches. It is believed that this decline is partly due to the fact that the gill nets catch a lot of female fish, with the result that reproduction is reduced. Another factor is the overfishing of the offshore banks by our own and foreign dragger fleets, some of which come from as far away as Russia and Japan. The close down of the Alcan fluorspar mines in 1978 saw a quick return to the fishery at St. Lawrence. With faster boats and an ultra-modern fish plant, which when working at full capacity employed over 200 people, the prospects looked good for the town. The future of this plant is now uncertain, and so is that of our town. The evening of November 18, 1929 was beautiful, sun shining, crisp and cool. At St. Lawrence and elsewhere on the Burin Peninsula, people went about their everyday work. They had no inkling whatsoever of what the next few hours held in store for them. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, the ground began to shake, buildings rattled. Everyone knew something had happened, but only a few knew it for what it was, an earthquake, and even they did not know what was to follow. The tide waters were quite high, but no particular attention was paid to that. Then, about 8 o'clock, things began to happen. The water drained completely out of the harbor and boats reeled over on their sides, a strange sight indeed. Then came the first wave, a wall of water 30 feet high. Receding, it met an incoming wave and returned with increased violence to the land, to be followed by a third and final wave. The noise was deafening as fishing stages, flakes and stores left their foundations and were swept out through the harbor. Many people evacuated their homes and fled to the safety of higher ground. In less than 30 minutes, the sea had done its worst. Scenes of destruction and desolation were everywhere. People viewing their destroyed homes, ruined fishing gear, premises, boats, and property were dazed and unable to realize fully the nature of the ordeal they had passed through. The firm of T. Farrell's Sons suffered heavy losses, as almost a complete voyage of fish was packed in casks, ready for shipment to Puerto Rico. All of it was ruined. They also lost boats and a great deal of fishing gear. A. Giovannini, who also conducted an extensive fishing industry, suffered severely. His large fishing store was washed out into the harbor by the waves, and hundreds of quintals of fish were ruined. It was not until the next day, which broke to a cold east wind with sleet and snow, that the outside world was informed of the disaster, because all communication by wire had been cut. On the 19th, Magistrate Hollett of Burin sent a wireless message via the SS Portia, informing the outside world of the devastation which had occurred on the Burin Peninsula. Once news of the disaster reached the outside, help started pouring in from all parts of the island. About $250,000 was received. Food, clothing, and other supplies were soon dispatched to the needy people along the coast from Burin to Lamelin. Although the center of the disturbance was directly off the south coast, the tremors of this earthquake were felt as far north as Little Bay Islands. The tremor was accompanied by a rumbling noise which caused many people to run from their houses and places of business to ascertain the cause of the disturbance. The vibrations caused dishes to fall from shelves, covers to rattle on stoves, lamps to fall from their brackets. At Cape Race, the shock was so heavy that the lighthouse building trembled to such an extent that several pounds of mercury were shaken out of the mercury box. The earthquake and tidal wave also affected the sea. An expert opinion was that the earthquake lay about 250 miles south of Newfoundland on the Grand Banks, the first report of such an incident this far east. The fishing grounds were swept clean of marine life, and it was more than a decade before fishing in the area returned to normal. It was the beginning of the lean years, and the people of St. Lawrence and the nearby areas were left with the never-to-be-forgotten terror of the night the seas came in. Only once before has Newfoundland experienced anything like it. Prowse records in his history that in the year before the American Civil War, a tidal wave swept the coast, taking a toll of 300 lives. One older resident of St. Lawrence vividly recalled the happenings of the tragic night. Looking back, he said, "It seems unreal. A grim moon, dark clouds, a terrific roar, and huge waves rushing in through the harbor, covering roads, fishing premises, and the houses that were near the waterfront. Then the ranting noises of these as they were torn from their foundations and taken with the waves out to sea. And wherever there was water always, now there was none. Only the wreckage of every description. And boats strewn everywhere, high and dry. No one slept that night. Everyone searched to try and find some of their property that had been carried away by the sea. The next day the wind was from the southeast, accompanied by wet snow, such desolation he'd never forget. Fishermen's stages, stores, and flakes were all destroyed, along with several boats and schooners. The harbor from end to end was strewn with wreckage of every description, a truly sorry sight to behold. It took several months before life returned to normal. Every shifting of the wind, every storm that made its appearance caused people to shudder. There was always that dread that the ocean may roll in again. Of course, there are many more stories that people tell about this event, but I will tell only two. St. Lawrence has a long, narrow strip of beach jutting out mid-harbor on which a road leads to its extremity, Shingle Point. The government wharf freight shed was situated on this point for years, before being moved to its present site. Also on this point was the home and small plot of land belonging to George Pike. He wasn't living there at the time of the tidal wave, having moved to the USA, and the house was occupied by his son, Jose Pike, a customs official and veteran of World War I. Shingle Point was in the direct path of the tides coming in. The Pike family had finished their evening meal and the three children were tucked in bed, and the parents were about to begin a game of cards with some friends who had dropped in, when they heard a loud roar. Going outside to see what it was, they heard loud cries from the townfolk on the main waterfront, telling them to leave the place immediately, run for their lives. The seas were coming in. In haste and fright, they snatched the children from their beds and started to run to safety. The beach is approximately a quarter of a mile long, and they just made the end of it adjoining the town road when the onslaught of the first wave covered it completely. The water went way above the second floor of the Pike house, but it withstood all three waves and remained standing when the water subsided. There was a small barn on the property in which the Pikes kept a horse named Jacko. The barn was taken out with the rush of the sea, and Jacko was in it. Men standing near but a safe distance from the waterfront noticed a dark object coming in on the next rush of water. Thinking it was a man, they gave cries of encouragement and were ready with any assistance they could give. When the water reached its highest ebb, The object turned out to be, to their great joy, not a man, but the pike horse, Jacko. The poor animal was so frightened he bolted past the road into the meadows and to the backwoods. It was 3 days before he made his appearance back in town. When the Pikes went back to view their home the next day, they found everything in a water-soaked condition and ruined. The lamps were still burning. And Mrs. Pike had bread baking in the oven at the time of their quick departure. This was now water-soaked dough. It was one of the wonders of that night, and talked about many, many times after, how that house had withstood that mad onslaught of water. The Pikes were glad it had, and thanked God over and over for their miraculous and narrow escape. Alfred Turpin was en route from St. Pierre with his father, Victor Turpin, who operated a general store, the night of the tidal wave. Here is his story in his own words. It was the 15th of November. My father told me to get the skiff ready as we were going to St. Pierre. Being an open skiff, not decked in, we had to put a long box, 6 ft, long by 5 ft, wide and high enough for us to get in and have lunch, also to store our gas, ropes, sails, etc. The 16th November at 2 a.m., we left St. Lawrence for St. Pierre. We arrived there at 7 a.m., did our business and saw some friends. By that time we were doubtful about returning home. A big wind had blown up, and soon there was a gale to northeast. We had to stay, and the next day the gale continued. On the morning of November 18th it was still blowing, but the wind had changed to the northwest, a fair time for home if the water was smooth. A rum runner came in from the USA, and we got the weather report from them. They said by the glass the wind would die out later in the day, but would change during the night to the southeast, with gale-force winds and snow. My father decided to leave around 4 p.m., and hoisting the sails, we took our departure. We did not start the engine as we wanted to come slow, as the wind was dying out, but to keep ahead of the breaking waves we were forced to start it, and we could not go back. My cousin, Joe Turpin, was with us, also another man from St. Lawrence, David Drake, who had been working at St. Pierre. I heard Joe say to him, "We are in the middle of a storm. We used to run off before the wind. When we'd see a huge wave coming, my father, being an experienced seaman, knew the waves would break on us, so he would reel around head to it and fall away again for the Newfoundland coast. The going was pretty bad. One wave was so bad and so high that when we sailed on it was so upright that the little house by the mast shooted down middle skiff to the engine. I heard father say the skiff is going to fall back on us. We held our breaths, but she didn't, but went down on the other side of the wave head on. So much so that the little house moved right back in its place. By that time another wave was coming. My father turned her around again, but not quick enough, and the sea broke across her stern. Joe grabbed the mast and held on for his life. I grabbed part of the engine house that was open. All I could see was a wall of water between Joe and I. Father was leaning hard to port on the steering stick when he came out of the water and holding on the rail of the skiff. Again, he had to put her before the wind, which lifted her. And some water ran out over the rail, but not enough, so he took the axe and cut the ceiling, so the water could run forward and I could bail it out. I bailed as hard as I could, but could not gain on the water. I thought my father had cut a plank. Joe joined me in bailing, and finally we got her dry. During this time we were sailing a fast clip. It was the sails that brought us out of the wailing water, as the engine had no control, and the propeller seemed to be racing in the foaming sea. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, we sighted what seemed to be a rock. We took it for the Eastern Shag Rock. Now we were looking for Long Island, but could not see it. Joe looked back and said, "That's Long Island, not the Shag Rock." The latter was all underwater as we passed by. Next, a welcome sight loomed up. We could see our own headland, Chamber Point Head Rock. A full moon was just rising over the ocean, and the wind started to die out. Thankfully, we hauled in for Cape Chapeau Rouge. Steaming in the harbor, we went in the little house to have a warm drink. We were just off Herring Cove when we struck something. Looking around, it seemed we were in a forest of wood. We ran upon a fish flake. All bows were stood on their end. Finally, under the weight of the skiff, the flake split in two. We slowed the engine down, then we saw a red building floating towards us. I thought it was my sister's house, as it was painted the same color. Nearing it, we found it to be a fishing store. We continued to edge our way in the harbor, through all the wreckage and debris, until we got to our Stage Head wharf. The tide was high, extremely high, and we rolled everything in the stage. By that time the tide was going out, and going so fast we had to tie 70 fathom of rope on the skiff and let her go out with the tide. And when it came back the next time, we hauled her right in around the fishing stage. It was only then, and in talking with some men, that we realized the tremendous happening we had sailed through, and were lucky enough to make our home port, having ridden the crests of a tidal wave. This was the last of Mr. Turpin's account, but he did add a little bit of humor. Having just made it from the French islands, and no doubt having a little something the law would love to come upon, he said, it was a great night to smuggle. There were no police officers or customs officials to trouble you. All you had to do was roll it ashore. The history of St. Lawrence has been marked by a number of sea disasters, some of which claimed lives and others which did not. The men of St. Lawrence were always aware of the closeness of death while battling the elements or helplessly watching as dory mates went under, or waiting for the ships that never came in. Mr. Dave Pike had a boat by the name of Contest. All hands were lost in October 1898. The boat went to Sydney for a load of coal. Something gave out and she went down, along with Mr. Dave Pike's two sons David and Hubert. Edward Pike was also drowned. The ship, P.K. Jacobs, belonged to the Reeves family. On September 1st, 1900, all hands were lost and there was never a piece of the wreckage found. The captain was Joseph Jacobs. The crew were Robert Pike, James Reeves, Louis Pike, Archibald Pike, Samuel Pike, George Poole, William Turpin, and Paddy Murphy. The P.K. Jacobs was last heard of when she took a squid baiting at St. Pierre. At this time, a great hurricane blew up. The boat was carrying bait in her wings, and it is possible that she went up on beam's end and sunk. The Lucy House was owned in Belliorum. On February 13, 1913, there was a northwest wind and snow coming in thick squalls. The Lucy House came into the harbor at about 3 o'clock. She was coming from Oporto, Portugal, where she had delivered a cargo of fish and was returning with a load of salt. The snow was so thick and visibility so low that she steered off course. She struck sunkers or submerged rocks at Blue Beach at low tide. The ship hung on the rocks for half a day, and at high tide she came off. A dory from across on the east side picked up 3 of the men and landed them in Doctor's Cove, where people took them in. The other 3 men, including Captain Courtney, unaware of the extent of the damage, determined to stay on board and get the ship to dock. They headed for Calip House and the ship began to founder. She sunk head first between Blue Beach and Cape Chapeau Rouge. The boat came to the surface again, and the captain jumped off the stern. The men in the dory could not save him because of the suction, which would have taken them down too. The Lucy House came to rest on Calip House Rock. Next morning, Mr. Victor Turpin, with his trap boat and some men, went out and towed the ship to dock. She was in dock for about a week and a half on her side. Someone bought her and towed her to the dry dock at St. Pierre. She was repaired and sailed again. This incident took place sometime in the year of 1916 or 1917. The SS Hump was a coastal boat under charter to the Newfoundland government. She was replacing the Susan on the mail and the passenger service in Fortune Bay. The SS Argyle, belonging to the Reed Company, was a coastal boat on the Placentia Run. She was under the command of Captain O'Ailey at the time of the incident. The SS Hump was coming into the harbor and the SS Argyle was leaving. The Hump entered on the left, heading for the Argyle, which was leaving on the same route. It was claimed that the Hump was at fault. The 2 boats met off flat rock and collided in the fog. The SS Hump sank, but all the men were saved. Captain O'Ailey stopped to survey the damage done to his ship and then continued en route. He stopped only long enough to inform some people who were squid jigging in the area of the accident. The Creusa G was owned by the firm of G.J. Giovanni. It was built and launched at St. Lawrence. It was built on the waterfront by Quirk's Brook near the residence of Bernard Murray. The builder was Bob Reeves. John Reeves was the first skipper, and the first trip it made was to St. John's with a cargo of dry fish. The ship then entered the coastal trade. She left St. Lawrence on Friday, February 19, 1917, en route to Sydney for a coal cargo. In the opinion of many experienced seamen, the ballast was not properly secured, and in the heavy sea, it was thrown in the wings of the boat, upsetting the center of gravity, which ultimately resulted in loss of equilibrium and capsizing. There was no trace of her found. All the crew on the boat at the time were from St. Lawrence. She was captained by Bob Fitzpatrick. The crew were Dave Slaney, Joe Slaney, Bob Pike, and Robert Slaney. There were 2 whalers belonging to Crosby Co. and a scow belonging to the Department of Transport involved in this incident. The scow, the Foundation Jupiter, was carrying a crane for dredging. Due to the fact that she was carrying heavy equipment, she was unable to maintain a great speed, so she was being aided by 2 whalers, the Rio Zam and the Fana. In 1946, the 3 boats entered the harbor in a blinding southeast snowstorm with gales of wind up to 60 miles an hour. The captain on one of the boats saw the lights of the staff house and thought that it was the lights of the harbor and went off course. One of the men who had sailed to St. Lawrence many times before warned the first mate that if they kept going they would crash on Blue Beach. He wouldn't listen, and later they crashed. The Rio Zam and the Foundation Jupiter ran ashore, the Foundation Jupiter on the eastern point of Blue Beach where it lodged on the rocks, and the Rio Zam on flat rock in the west of Blue Beach. The other whaler, the Fana, managed to free herself by cutting the cable. She disappeared out to sea. The citizens of St. Lawrence thought that she was lost, but the next evening she sailed into the harbor. The Foundation Jupiter was scrapped and the Rio Zam beat up on the rocks. Everyone was saved, and the skeletons of the boat still remain at Blue Beach.A. Murray, in Geological Survey of Newfoundland, reports 1881 to 1909 described work that was done on Mine Cove vein prior to 1870, when a tunnel was driven on a fluorspar vein about 6 inches wide, which was said to have contained some silver. Another tunnel appears to have been driven prior to 1870 on a low-grade fluorspar vein which outcrops in Chambers Cove. Based on these old workings near Little Lawn Point, Charles Fox Bennett obtained mineral rights in this area in 1907, but did no work on the veins. In 1910, the Bethlehem Steel Company did some exploration work on an iron showing on the east side of St. Lawrence Harbor. The fluorspar vein known as the Black Duck was surveyed and staked for a Mr. Campbell of St. John's early in this century. Campbell's claims were later acquired by W. H. Taylor, also of St. John's. J. F. Morris of Portland, Maine, in 1928, obtained leases on 6 claims in the St. Lawrence area. Taylor, in 1929, went to New York, where he sold his claims to W.E. Seibert, at that time an accountant with the Corporation Trust Company Ltd. in New York. Seibert interested 3 others, namely a Mr. Sawyer, a Mr. Harrison, and a Mr. Molnar. Mr. Seibert began a correspondence with businessman Aubrey B. Farrell, who became his representative in St. Lawrence. In 1932, Seibert and his 3 partners visited St. Lawrence, and plans were made to prospect the area and ascertain the possibility of producing fluorspar. 6 men were employed as prospectors, and before the rigors of the Newfoundland winter set in, several veins had been discovered. Seibert and his associates decided to try to raise sufficient funds to purchase second-hand mining equipment in order to start operating, provided that the miners, the people of the area, would agree to mine the ore and handpick the product to bring it up to market specifications. If and when the ore was sold, the workers would be recompensed. The local merchants agreed to stake the men so engaged until their wages were forthcoming, and the Seibert Group and the St. Lawrence Corporation of Newfoundland, Ltd., known locally as the Cooperation, went into production. All through the year 1933, the men of the St. Lawrence area worked for a mere pittance. From this humble beginning, a great new industry emerged, an industry unique in the annals of mining. It was created by the men of St. Lawrence and Little St. Lawrence, men who had never before worked in mines. In spite of their inexperience, they took up the challenge and went down into the bowels of the earth to produce the needed tonnage. It has been said that it takes a decade to develop a competent miner. It speaks well for the caliber of men in our area that those who pioneered the industry in St. Lawrence, even the leaders and supervisors, were local men. The way they adapted themselves to the new industry, working most of the time under very trying circumstances, is a testament to their courage and fortitude. During the 1920s, a number of fluorspar users sent representatives to St. Lawrence to assess the outcroppings in the area. Their consensus was that, as the veins had a high igneous rock content, they would be very shallow and their potential limited. None of the big fluorspar consumers was prepared to buy, prospect, or diamond drill in the area to prove its potential. Government money was not available for such projects, and so it was up to the people themselves to prove that fluorspar did exist in substantial deposits. Prove it they did. It is extremely doubtful if the fluorspar mines would have been developed had it not been for the overwhelming enthusiasm of the local people. The prospecting by the Seibert Group in 1931 and 1932 aroused the interest of a saint, Johns-based group which later became known as the Hookie-Daw interest. From this point on, the history of mining in St. Lawrence involves two companies and their parallel development. Seibert and his company St. Lawrence Newfoundland Corporation, Ltd., in beginning to develop their claims, were taking a gamble. The exact size of their gamble is not known, but it is a fact that most of their bet was riding on the backs of the men of St. Lawrence. According to R. Slaney, more incredible than fiction, work was begun on the Black Duck vein with equipment which Seibert acquired from a bankrupt contractor for about $2,500. This equipment was shipped to St. Lawrence in the spring of 1933, where it was unloaded and transported on sleds by the men of St. Lawrence to the Black Duck site. The rest of the spring was spent by the men in building an ore mill. The mill completed, the men turned their attention to mining the required 2,000 tons of saleable ore. Working with pickaxes and jackhammers, the men slowly achieved the goal Seibert had set for them. Now it had only to be sold for the men to receive their wages. The ore was shipped to the Dominion Steel and Coal Corporation steel plant at Sydney, Nova Scotia in 1934, where it was tested to see if it could meet DOSCO's requirements for use as a flux in their iron ore refining operation. Finally, the testing was ended, the ore was sold, and the men received the wages for which they had worked and waited for a year. 15 cents an hour was never harder earned. 60 with the sale of this initial shipment, the St. Lawrence Corporation of Newfoundland, Ltd., was ready to go into full-scale operation. Due to limited financing, it was decided to develop the Black Duck vein as an open-pit operation. Though an expedient decision for the moment, as sinking shafts and driving drifts and raises is costly, in the long run it would have been less costly than the open-pit method. The trouble began soon after the pit was opened, and it got worse as the pit got deeper. The problem was flooding. The accumulation of groundwater and precipitation was constant, and the pumps, secondhand, were inadequate to deal with it. Often the men had to struggle through waist-deep water to save the pumps and equipment from the waters. Finally, when the Black Duck mine reached a depth of about 70 feet, it became apparent that the old, second-hand pumps could not be relied upon to keep the cut emptied of water, and drifting was started. This presented a different set of problems, but problems nonetheless. There were no provisions made for adequate ventilation. In the drifts and stokes, the ore was drilled with dry hammers, and this dry drilling created both dust and smoke. The dust was so thick that it clogged the eyes and nostrils of the miners, and combined with the smoke, was so dense as to obscure vision. The men continued to work. The equipment was old and breakdowns were frequent. The men continued to work. Their work underground was extremely dangerous, but they did not have hard hats or safety boots or safety boots. Above ground, they had no changing rooms, no dining room, not even suitable drinking water. The men continued to work because of what they had invested in this mine. They regarded it as their mine. 61, due to the difficulty of obtaining equipment which arose with World War II, Black Duck mine was forced to cease operations in 1942, but activity was increased at the Iron Springs mine, which had been opened in 1937. Here too, dry drilling was used during the first years of operation, and the smoke and dust problems were even worse than those in Black Duck, because of the narrowness of the fluorspar vein. This vein was only about 30 inches wide, and again there were no adequate ventilation facilities. The smoke and dust were, at times, so thick that one had to walk right up to the driller before he could be seen. The problem in the Iron Springs mine was solved in the early 1940s with the introduction of wet drilling. This and other related improvements in working conditions was brought about through the efforts of a newly formed union. The first union at St. Lawrence, the St. Lawrence Miners and Laborers Protective Union, was formed in 1939. Though affiliated with the Newfoundland Federation of Labor, this union was not registered with the Registrar of Trade Unions. This union was dissolved early in 1941, and in March 1941 a new union, the St. Lawrence Workers Protective Union, was formed. This union, unlike the first, was registered with the Registrar of Trade Unions at St. John's, but was not affiliated with the Newfoundland Federation of Labor. Shortly after the union's registration, a series of strikes commenced involving the issues of union recognition, higher wages, and improved working conditions. No fewer than 5 strikes occurred between March and December 1941. After various attempts at mediation, the Newfoundland Government Commission appointed a trade dispute board on December 6, 1941. In its terms of reference, it was requested to look into the wage scale, 62 of the miners, the increased cost of living, and the working conditions of the miners. Significantly, the Trade Dispute Board ruled that St. Lawrence had made the transition from a fishing community to a mining community and should, in future, be compared to mining towns rather than fishing towns. Also significantly, in the report of the board, there was no mention made of the fact that ventilation in the mines was totally inadequate. Activities at the Hookie-Daw claims took a somewhat different course from those at the Seibert claims. Again, the Newfoundlanders who had first staked claims did not develop them. In this case, Hookie and his associates sold 51% of their interest to J. Lavino Co., an American company involved in the ferro-alloy business. Lavino, on 11 May 1937, incorporated the American Newfoundland Fluorspar Company Limited and began an exploration shaft on the Terre-Fair vein. The Terre-Fair shaft was sunk to a depth of 85 feet, and at that level a crosscut was driven which exposed 3 veins, but very little drifting was done on these veins, perhaps because their discovery was overshadowed by the discovery, also in 1937, of the Director vein. Work at Terre-Fair was discontinued in 1938, when development on number 1 shaft at the Director began. This shaft, by 1939, had reached a depth of 150 feet, and about 800 feet of drifting had been done. The development of Director Mine by Newfoundland Fluorspar Limited was different than had been the Black Duck development. Lavino's company did not have the same capital limitations as the Seibert Group had faced. Director Mine was well equipped from the start, and as mining progressed, mucking machines, electric hammers, and other modern equipment were installed. As soon as was possible, there was erected a modern facility containing a dining room and a dry house where miners could change their clothes and shower. This was a considerable improvement over the conditions facing the miners at the Black Duck and Iron Springs mines. Sometime in 1938, Edwin M. Lavino, president of E.J. Lavino and Company, lost interest in the St. Lawrence mines and arranged to sell American Newfoundland Fluorspar, Ltd., to Aluminum Company of Canada, Ltd. Alcan. This sale was opposed by the Hookie-Daw Group, Lavino's partners, but their opposition came to nothing, they having already sold Lavino 51%, the controlling interest in the company. The sale was completed, and in March 1940, a new company, Newfoundland Fluorspar, Limited Newfluor, was incorporated. Although it would not become apparent until sometime later, Alcan bought much more than they realized at the time of the sale. Alcan, of course, had a ready Canadian market for their product. The fluorspar from the Newfluor mines was used by the parent company in the aluminum-making process at their Arvida, Quebec plant. The St. Lawrence Corporation chose to rely on American markets for their sales, and this, in the end, was to prove their undoing. Seibert's involvement with the Americans began when the U.S. entered World War II. In order to ensure a constant supply of fluorspar to their steel plants, the Americans agreed to finance a new mill at the Iron Springs mine. The corporation, then, concentrated on producing acid-grade ore, which it sold through a subsidiary in the U.S. St. Lawrence Fluorspar, Inc. As long as the contracts with the U.S. government were in effect, Seibert did fairly well with his all-American sales policy. He even managed, in 641,950, to bluff the Newfoundland government into giving him a loan which allowed him to continue supplying the American market. The negative effects of this all-American policy were realized in 1957, when Seibert's American contracts came to an end. With his American market no longer interested in his product, Seibert turned to the Canadian market, which he had ignored up to this time, only to find that Canadian buyers were being supplied by foreign producers, chiefly Mexican, who could supply ore which was not only cheaper than that from St. Lawrence, but was also of a better grade. Faced with this unfair competition, the corporation turned to the Canadian government, asking that an import duty be placed on foreign ore imports to provide protection for St. Lawrence Fluorspar. The Canadian government, in their inquiries into the matter, finding that Seibert owned a major interest in a Mexican fluorspar company, doubted his sincerity and denied his request. This refusal, coupled with the collapse, in 1957, of the Blue Beach mine, signaled the end of the corporation in St. Lawrence. The corporation suspended mining operations in 1957, and finally in 1965, all its assets and holdings and liabilities passed into the hands of Newfoundland Fluorspar, Ltd. It was not until after the corporation had shut down its operations that the real and horrible truth about the St. Lawrence Mines was discovered. As early as 1941, the St. Lawrence Workers' Protective Union had called a work stoppage, demanding improved working conditions. Unfortunately, the improvements ordered by the Board of Inquiry, which investigated conditions at the mines, did not include improved ventilation. They inspected the mines when they had lain idle for several days. And so the dust problem was not apparent to them in their report. They indicated that the flow of water in the mines purified the air. No. One was aware at the time, of course, that air-purifying water was carrying with it radon gas leaked out of the surrounding rocks. Only in 1948 did one of the miners, Rennie Slaney, notice that an alarming number of miners were becoming ill. Strong men who were accustomed to strenuous work, began to complain of shortness of breath. There was, at the same time, what was perceived as an unwillingness to work on the part of some of the men. Frequently, lunch boxes went untouched. There was noticed among some of the men vomiting, severe headaches, and a tendency to sweat profusely at the least exertion. Concern for these men began to grow. In the late 40s and early 50s, some of the miners were sent to the sanatorium in St. John's, where they were treated for tuberculosis and later released as cured. These men returned to St. Lawrence to die, some quickly, some slowly. Not until 1967 was the true situation made known to the public. In February of that year, an official brief on health conditions at the St. Lawrence Mines was released. This brief termed St. Lawrence a national disaster. In April of 1967, a royal commission was instituted to investigate the fluorspar mines at St. Lawrence. The members of the commission, Mr. Finton Aylward, Mr. Frederick Glover, Dr. H. Bliss Murphy, and Dr. W. David Parsons presented their findings to the Lieut. Gov. E. John Harnham in July 1969. Among their findings was the fact that an estimated 150 miners had died and as many as 100 were permanently disabled with lung cancer, silicosis, and chronic obstructive diseases, all derived from conditions in the fluorspar mines. These mines, which had been seen as a godsend by the people of St. Lawrence, brought a period of economic prosperity to the town, but at an awful cost the lives of the young men of the town. Still, work went on at St. Lawrence. In August 1968, Minister of Mines, the Hon. W.R. Callahan, detonated an underground explosion marking the official opening for production of Terre Mine. In 1972, Blue Beach Mine, the collapse of which in 1957 had compounded Sybert's problems, was returned to production. Also in 1972, a new crushing and screening mill was put into operation. This new activity came about as a result of the fact that the end was in sight for Director Mine. At the end of 1965, New Fluor had shipped 1,219,000 tons of ore, most of which came from Director. According to a statement released by Alcan Fluorspar Works in ca. 1967, it appears that Director Mine will be able to maintain its present rate of production for another 5 years, after which the production rate will drop sharply to less than 1/3 of its present rate. The increased activity of 1972 seemed to assure a measure of security to the miners in the community of St. Lawrence, but this sense of security was to be short-lived. In 1977, Alcan announced that its operations at St. Lawrence would cease. The reasons for Alcan's withdrawal were, in terms of economics, expedient. Prolonged labor disputes in 1975 to 1976, the high cost of producing ore at St. Lawrence, plus the compensation which Alcan was required to pay to miners and their families as a result of the ravages of the miners' disease, made the lower-cost Mexican ore more and more attractive. Concerted efforts by the community and by the Newfoundland government to bring about a reconsideration on the part of Alcan were fruitless. Newfoundland government requests to the federal government for the imposition of import duties on Mexican ore went unheeded. Apparently, the lives of a town and its people are secondary to corporate profits. The most. Rev. P.J. Skinner, Archbishop of St. John's, said, in a letter to Alcan President David Calver, by the principles of social justice, it would be regrettable for a corporation which has derived considerable economic benefit from St. Lawrence to abandon a community and its people, without doing its utmost to aid them to obtain another means of livelihood, as was amply demonstrated, Corporations such as Alcan operate according to principles other than those of social justice. Probably the last vessel of her kind which will ever visit St. Lawrence Harbor, the ore carrier on Tadak, removed the last 8,500 tons of ore stockpiled at St. Lawrence in 1978. The history of St. Lawrence since 1933 has been filled with waiting. The people of St. Lawrence worked to establish mining operations, and they waited over a year to receive any wages. After years of working for ridiculously low wages, the miners went on strike for better pay. Appeals to their sense of patriotism by the Commission government brought the men back to work to help the war effort with their grievances unresolved. The men waited. Efforts to achieve better wages and working conditions in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s brought repeated and prolonged strikes and lockouts. More waiting. The final shutdown of Alcan operations in 1978, throwing 350 men out of work, brought more waiting, this time waiting for an alternative industry for the town. To quote a news item printed in the St. John's Daily News on the 1980 opening of the new fisheries products plant in St. Lawrence, now we are anticipating a bright future with a stable economy, replacing though in a small way the active mining industry we lost, and a return to the prosperity St. Lawrence is enjoyed for over 40 years. The optimism of the writer was, unfortunately, ill-founded. From its opening in 1980, this plant operated less than 12 months. In 1982, it operated a bare 2 months, not long enough to qualify its employees for UIC benefits. The waiting continued. In 1983, the federal government released plans for a reorganization of the fishery in the Atlantic provinces. This plan calls for the closure of the St. Lawrence fish plant. The Newfoundland government is opposed to this closure, and as negotiations continue, the town waits as it has so many times before, never losing hope in spite of its many adversities. Always industrious and independent, the people of St. Lawrence ask only to be allowed to turn their industry to a useful purpose and to maintain their independence. Dehydrating were not as yet known. Several hogs were butchered in the fall for food in the winter. Large quantities of pork, liver, and blood sausage were always made. The balance of the meat was packed in salt brine to be used in the summer. No one seemed to know anything about smoked hams and bacon until about 1885. Some of the bladders of the hogs were blown up like toy balloons and left to dry out. They were then cut open at one end and used as tobacco pouches. 1 or 2 cows provided milk and butter. A handful of sprigs tied together served to whisk cream into butter. The Swiss always made a year's supply of cheese in the springtime. A small patch of barley was always seeded. This barley, when roasted, made a perfect substitute for coffee. Wheat bread was a rarity because flour had to be bought in St. Paul. In 1869, a small flour mill was established at Minnetonka Mills. When this mill commenced operating, farmers could take wheat there and get it exchanged for a certain amount of flour, bran, shorts, and middlings. No cash was needed. All materials were barter. Before this small mill was established at Minnetonka Mills, these early settlers had no form of transportation and carried their flour on their backs. And from St. Paul, a distance of 30 to 40 miles. Income. The fertility of the soil promised big crops of grain wheat. Corn, oats, barley, and rye. Wheat was going to be their main cash crop. It took several years to clear enough land to raise more grain than was needed for flour and feed, and even then there was no market for it nearer than St. Paul. In 1857, however, some businessmen established an outlet in Chaska. The only income the settlers had until 1857 was from ginseng and cranberries. In 1857, China ran short of the very thing that grew in the big woods by the ton ginseng. From the sweet-tasting root, the Chinese made a precious, life-giving drug. Ginseng they had to have. Through government agents, they offered from $4 to $18 a pound for the dried root. Freshly dug roots were incredibly heavy, but they grew lighter as they dried. Usually several settlers walked to St. Paul together with their dried roots and obtained cash for them. When steamboats made periodic trips to Chaska, they could sell the roots there. The roots were harvested in midsummer. The woods were combed of the valuable root by the settlers and a few Indians from the small reservation at Shakopee. And when the Civil War broke out, the ginseng era came to an end. However, the Indians kept on digging roots throughout the unpastured woods until about 1885. Many a sack of cranberries was carried to St. Paul and bartered for absolute necessities. Some of the settlers would leave their homesteads for weeks to earn a little money elsewhere.
Usually in St. Paul, which was now a booming little village. Leonard
Breher, for example, spent some months each year at his cabinet. Maker trade there. Clothing. Most of the early settlers had brought along enough clothing to provide for their needs for the first few years after their arrival. Later, the task of clothing growing children created a serious difficulty. Even if the money had been available, cloth was scarce, and practically all of the children's clothing was cut and sewn by the mother. Materials used were the cheapest cotton and woolen. Goods available: denim, prints, cotton, and woolen flannel. Wool from the sheep was spun with the old spinning wheel brought along from Europe and then knitted into mittens, stockings, etc. for the whole family. Wooden shoes.
In the beginning, the Dutch all wore wooden shoes. Each
member of the grown family brought a pair along from Holland or Belgium. Even some of the older children had a pair. One of these Dutch immigrants, a shoemaker by trade, settled in Chaska, plied his trade there, and for quite a few years furnished our Dutch colony with their needs. The use of wooden shoes steadily declined. These Dutch, and even some of the Germans, were also masters of the art of making willow baskets. The art has somewhat passed down to the present generations, and some homemade willow baskets can yet be seen. Maple syrup. There were very many maple trees in the area, and nearly everyone made maple syrup. The trees were tapped with a 34 auger, and a sumac spile was inserted. A trough container for the sap was made from logs 12 to 15 inches in diameter and about 24 inches long. These were split in half and hollowed out with a adze. Once or twice a day, depending on the flow of the sap, it was gathered and then boiled down in the woods in an open iron kettle or in a wash boiler on the kitchen stove. About 25 to 30 gallons of sap was required to produce a gallon of syrup. Some also made maple sugar for jellies and jams and candy for the children. Rock candy was made from the syrup by hanging a white thread in it and leaving it undisturbed for 5 or 6 weeks. Soap. Soap making was a must chore in the spring. As lye was not available commercially, the settlers had to produce it themselves.
A barrel for the process was obtained by sawing a thick hollow
elm log to a length of about 4 feet and boarding it shut on one end. This end was then bored full of small seepage holes. The barrel was then filled with wood ashes. Water was then poured on top of the ashes and the resultant seepage draining through
the perforations in the bottom of the barrel into a wooden tub
constituted a strong lye. The year's accumulation of fats was then added, and the mixture boiled in an open iron kettle until it attained a liquid consistency. It was then left in the kettle to cool and harden overnight. In the morning, it was ready to be cut into squares and stored for use as needed. Soft water. The rain barrel was the main source of soft water, as well as a prolific mosquito hatchery. During dry seasons, a nearby lake supplied water for wash days. Ice and snow melted supplied their needs in winter. The first cisterns appeared in the community in the 1880s. Tobacco. In the beginning, all the settlers who indulged in smoking raised on their own tobacco. The leaves were stripped before the first frost. In the fall, hung up in a shed to dry, then packed down tight into a barrel to go through a sweating period. It was considered cured in about a month and ready for the pipe. Lamps. Until about 1860, oil lamps were non-existent. The first Lithium in the United States was discovered at Oil Creek, Pennsylvania, in 1859, and it was over 10 years later when the first oil lamps and kerosene arrived in this sector. The settlers, therefore, had to depend exclusively upon candles. In these early years, all candles were homemade of tallow wells. The wells were 3 to 4 feet in diameter and in many instances 30 to 40 feet deep. The first wells were lined out with either field stones or boards. Later, the Chaska brickyards made a brick which would fit a circle of about 314 feet, and all deeper wells were lined with them. These bricks can still be seen at the Carver County Historical Society in Waconia. Water was raised from the well with a windlass or a pulley, and with the famous old oaken bucket, or simply with a pail and a rope. During the latter part of the pioneer days, wooden pumps and wooden pipes came into use. The watering trough for the livestock was made from a log 15 to 18 inches in diameter and about 12 to 15 feet long, flattened on one side and then hollowed out with an adze. During the 1890s, deep wells and windmills appeared. The windmills were gradually replaced by the gasoline engine, and now, since every farm in the parish has been electrified, the gasoline engine has been replaced by the electric motor of boats. Boats were made from very large logs. The bottom was slabbed off with a broad axe and then pointed at both ends, somewhat like a canoe, and finally hollowed out with an adze. The entire parish with its 30 lakes did not have a boat made from the boards until about 1885. Bake ovens, and many of the families, especially the larger ones, had an outside bake oven. It was built of brick about 4 feet square and 4 feet high. In preparation for the actual baking, the oven was heated for about an hour by a large fire. The fire was then withdrawn, replaced by the loaves, and within 1 hour they were perfectly baked. Liquor. Until about 1885, whiskey was not taxed by either state or federal government and was sold for 35 to 50 per gallon. The first storekeepers in Chaska always had a barrel of whiskey tapped with a faucet in their places of business, together with a tin cup for the self-service of the customer. Raccoon fat was rendered, and the lard was used to grease work harnesses and to soften and waterproof shoes. Skunk. The fat was rendered and the oil preserved in bottles. It was used primarily as an ointment to apply on burns, cuts, and other wounds and sores. Its healing qualities were excellent. Transportation. The chief mode of transportation among the first settlers was walking. They walked to St. Paul for provisions. The entire family walked to church on Sundays and holidays, a distance up to 314 miles or more. Even those who owned oxen preferred walking, because the animals were too slow, and consequently they were used only to haul heavy loads such as cordwood, grain, and for field work. It took a whole day to make a trip with the oxen to Chaska and return. In the early 1860s, when some horses came into the region, it required less than half the time to travel the same distance. Steamboats, which made periodic trips to Chaska, carried the grain, cordwood, and produced to the market in St. Paul, until the first railroad passed through Chaska in 1870. Victoria got its first railroad in 1882. The settlers who had horses drove to church with a lumber wagon until 1885 to 1890, when two-seated platform buggies and top buggies appeared. About this time, a large barn was built on the extreme east end of the church property in the shade of some large trees. This barn was for the protection of the horses from the severe cold in winter and the hot sun in summer. In 1911, the first automobile appeared in Victoria. It was owned by Anton Schmieg, a Jackson touring car with right-hand drive and brass operating levers on the outside. A little later, Hubert Kelzer bought an Overland, right-hand drive and operating levers on the inside. Neither of these cars had a self-starter. A trip to Chaska and return which formerly required a full day's travel, could now be made within a half hour. Ox yoke. An important chapter in the history of the parish could be written in terms of the curved blocks of wood, the ox yoke. It was an epochal day thousands of years ago when certain unknown tribes ceased their wanderings for food and made permanent homes. They built fences to confine their livestock, began to plant seeds, and devised ways to use the power of animals. Thus was the beginning of training oxen to be used where power was needed. As the settlers of this area conquered the wilderness, patient, plodding oxen furnished the power. They hauled cumbersome, four-wheeled carts and stone boats laden with tools and household goods. As home sites were staked and men felled trees for houses and barns, oxen pulled the trees to the building site and then onto the building on skids as the walls mounted higher. When trees were cut down to clear more land, the patient ox dragged the fallen giants away. In the spring, oxen pulled plows among the stumps, and grain and vegetables grew green and lush in the soil. The oxen had stirred for the first time since the dawn of creation. While the settlers established themselves, oxen played their humble role. They plowed all the land and pulled all the grain and wood to the market. This continued until the late 60s to the early 80s, when horses appeared on the scene. Thus, briefly summarizing the situation which obtained at the time, the following facts have been fully established. One, that at the end of 1855 there already were 43 heads of families and young men of legal age in the community, and the population was steadily increasing. 2, that a church was badly needed. 3, that the building of a log church did not involve any outlay of cash, save for a few blocks and window panes. 4, that the settlers held several meetings in 1855 to organize a parish and build a church, but could not agree on the site. 5, that the services were always held in the home of some settler, and it is only natural to assume that these homes were not large enough to accommodate all who came to the services. 6, that M.J. Burkhart was buried in the parish cemetery in August 1857. 7, that this was the only Catholic cemetery in Carver County at the time. 8, that Shakopee affected the organization of St. Mark's Parish and commenced building a church in 1856. 9, that the St. Victoria Parish was organized soon after Shakopee commenced building a church, therefore considering the documentary evidence and the statements of the first pioneers, we can with confidence state that the organization of the St. Victoria Parish was consummate in the late fall of 1856. As stated above, St. Victoria Parish was organized in the late fall of 1856. The site was selected. 30 acres of land were donated. A cemetery had been established, and the records of St. Mark's Church at Shakopee show that in the beginning of 1857 the parish was served periodically by the Benedictine Fathers at intervals of about 3 months. The building of the church did not involve any monetary expense. The material to be used was logs, of which there were plenty nearby and could be obtained for the asking. Why the church building was not completed until the end of 1858 will never be known, unless some old records of the Benedictine Fathers will be uncovered to throw more light on the matter. At least 2 carpenters, namely Leonard Brer and Carl Diet, were among the first settlers of the community, and it was only natural that they donated their services. The 44 settlers were all anxious to help. Now trees had to be cut down, and when cut into proper lengths they had to be laboriously dragged out of the woods by ox power to the site and then dressed on 2 sides with a broadaxe. The logging up of the building was quite an undertaking. The logs had to be notched at each end to fit a saddle on the nether log in order to make a solid wall. As the walls grew higher, the logs, weighing 1,000 to 1,500 pounds, were raised on skids. It took a lot of manpower. After the log walls were completed, the carpenters took over. A roof had to be constructed with tamarack poles for beams on rafters. These poles were found in abundance in the neighboring meadows and sloughs. Openings had to be cut for doors and windows, frames built, doors and window sash boards had to be sawed from a log and built by hand. Boards also had to be sawed by hand from logs for the floor and the roof. Material used for shingles was red oak, the easiest to split. Red oak logs from 6 to 8 inches in diameter were sawed into 214-foot lengths and then split into thin sheets which served as shingles. And to do all these things, the pioneer carpenter had only a few tools: a saw, hammer, hatchet, draw knife, adze, brace and bits, a level, and a plane. After the carpenter's work was completed, all the open spaces between the logs were chinked and plastered with yellow clay and a sprinkling of hay or straw. Carl Dythelm and Leonard Breher supervised and did most of the carpenter work on the church. The necessary furniture, altar, communion railing, confessional, and pews were fashioned by local hands. To this day, the clapper used on Holy Thursday is the one made by Leonard Breher. To buy commercially made furniture in those times was out of the question. Not only was the community poor, but the country itself was in the grip of a financial depression during which more than 5,500 banks went bankrupt, and depositors and stock holders lost over $900 million. The location of the little church, 24 x 30 feet, facing south, was about 30 feet to the north of the entrance of the present church. A small lean-to was constructed of boards to serve as a sacristy. The interior of the church was given a coat of lime whitewash. When the workers completed the job, one of them is said to have remarked, "Now we can tell our grandchildren that the church of St. Victoria was as large as the first cathedral in St. Paul," and so it actually was. The people were happy to have a permanent place of worship. The Benedictines, who had established St. John's Abbey at College Ville and who had a priory at Shakopee, continued to serve the small congregation from Shakopee at more or less regular visits. On the fee, many Sundays when no Mass was offered, the people gathered at the church to pray the rosary and a litany and to read the gospel of the day. In the spring of 1859, a new era began, and all was well. The trading center had moved from St. Paul to Chaska. The parish had been organized. A cemetery was established, the church was built, and regular services were being held. The little log church was not too large, but it adequately served the purpose. Each year, more land had been cleared, and as the size of the fields increased, larger crops of wheat were produced and could now be sold for cash at Chaska. Everybody was happy, and the drab existence, which all of the first settlers had encountered, gradually faded out. Their contentment, however, was not destined to last very long. In 1863, the Hollanders and the Belgians began to arrive in the Fee area of the parish. This did not relieve the overcrowded situation of the little log church. With the arrival of these newcomers there, it soon became obvious that the little church was too small, and that a much larger church was needed. All of the settlers who had built the church were agreed that it would be impracticable to build a larger log church. Bricks were already being manufactured in Chaska, and although they could be bought for $2 or $3 per thousand, the settlers' incomes were not sufficient as yet to assume the expense of building a large church. Even when they had some wheat or cordwood to sell, money was very scarce and was badly needed to improve the buildings on their own homesteads. The Dutch, who were arriving steadily, were also very poor. The free homesteads in the community had all been taken up, and they had to buy out a Yankee homesteader with what little money they had. 2 or 3 of these immigrants usually bought a 160-acre homestead and then divided it up among themselves. The population was increasing fast, even though some of the very first settlers had sold their land and moved away. The little church was entirely too small to accommodate all who came to Sunday services. The building could not be enlarged, and a new church of material other than logs would cost a considerable sum of money. Therefore, the matter dragged along until 1870, when it was finally agreed to build the present brick structure. Fathers Matthew Sturenberg and Valentine Stimler negotiated the building of the church. Who the architect was or whether a contract was let to construct the building, whether it was put up piecemeal or by day. Labor is not mentioned in the records. It is known, however, that, with some help, John Siems, a bricklayer by profession, who lived on the east shore of Lake Bavaria, laid all the brick. The cost of the building, erected in 1870, was $7,000.8. The building did not hold the present steeple and had only a small turret on the upper east end of the structure to house the bell until 1884, when the present steeple was erected by Henry Becker of Bell Plain. About 1890, a beautiful main altar and two side altars were built and installed by F.X. Herscher and his son Joseph of Shakopee. In 1896, the sanctuary was remodeled and the communion rail was moved out of the sanctuary under the direction of Father Raymond Holte. In 1953, because of overcrowded conditions, Father Bernardine Hahn remodeled the entire interior of the church. He removed the side altars, moved the communion railing closer to the sanctuary, thereby adding 2 rows of seats and considerably increasing the seating capacity. The balcony seating was also rearranged to add more seats. Since all of the early Catholic settlers in Victoria had received their religious training in Catholic schools, it was only natural that they also wanted their children to have the same training under the supervision of the priest and teacher. In short, they wanted their children to be good Catholics and good citizens. In addition to secular subjects, they wanted their children to be instructed in the fundamentals of the Catholic faith, the most precious heritage they had brought along from their homeland. So at the same time that the log church was built, a school was also built. The location was about 75 feet directly east of the present brick church. The building was of the same construction as the church, namely logs, although not quite as large. The south side of the building was one large room which served as a schoolroom, while the north half was used as living quarters for the teacher. There also was a fairly high attic with room for an extra bed and a storage room. After several years, the school proved too small and the old church served as an additional schoolroom until about 1875, when a large 2-story frame building was constructed. In 1881, the Franciscan Sisters of Milwaukee took charge of the school and served until July 1888. Their names were Sisters Teresa, Philomena, Catherine, Innocence, Gonzaga, Hilaria, and Claudia. After the Franciscan sisters left, Father Aloysius Wewer, OFM, who served the parish from 1886 to 1892, made every effort to get other sisters to take charge of the school. He was unsuccessful until 1891, when the Sisters of Christian Charity arrived. During the 2-year interim, 188890, Lena Brer Byers was employed to teach. The first Sisters of Christian Charity arrived in the parish of St. Victoria on August 27, 1889, and were warmly welcomed by the Reverend Pastor Aloysius Wewer and the parishioners. School opened on September 2nd with an enrollment of 50 pupils, divided into 2 groups. Sister Amanda Sealer, the superior, taught. The upper division Sister Leonella Roof had charge of the primary grades. Sister Erin Trudis Manuel was the housekeeper. The pupils afforded their new teachers pleasure by their good conduct, diligence, and attention. In October 1889, the parochial school of St. Victoria became a district school, and as such was visited occasionally by the state examiner and members of the Board of Trustees, who were well pleased with the pupils' achievements. Attendance, however, was rather irregular due to inclement weather and difficulty in transportation during the winter months. This prevented the smaller children from covering great distances, and during the harvest season the older children were needed at home. Thus, at times, the average attendance dropped to 20 pupils. The first class of communicants was prepared by the sisters for June 21, 1892, and consisted of 4 boys and 7 girls. The sacrament of confirmation was administered in nearby Chaska when The opportunity presented itself. In July 1892, Rev. Aloysius Wewer was replaced by Rev. Patrick OFM, who in turn was succeeded in November 1894 by Rev. Cletus OFM. During the summer of 1894, Sister Chris Tiana Germrod became superior of the convent and took over the teaching of the upper grades. The sisters had the privilege of having the Blessed Sacrament reserved in their convent chapel and enjoyed solemn religious services on one or the other great feast of the year when the Franciscan fathers from the neighboring parishes came to Victoria. Nevertheless, serious difficulty arose as time went by. Since Victoria had no resident pastor, Holy Massachusetts was offered only twice a month on Sundays and, if possible, 4 times during the month, on weekdays for the children. On Sundays on which no Holy Mass was celebrated, the sisters, pupils, and parishioners assembled in the parish church for a common prayer hour to substitute for divine services. Naturally, the regular reception of the sacraments proved a difficulty also, and these facts decided against the sisters' further stay in the parish of St. Victoria. They relinquished their activity in June 1895. In 1895, J.M. Moretz was employed as teacher, and he served in that capacity until 1900. The school population had now increased considerably, and as there were too many pupils for one teacher, Teresa Dython was employed for several years and assisted Mr. Moretz by taking over several of the lower grades. Being in the spring of 1900, the Rev. Rudolph Horstmann, after a year's negotiations, came to an agreement with the Sisters of St. Benedict of St. Joseph, Minnesota. They arrived in the summer of 1900, took up residence at St. Victoria School, and have served the Pay School continuously to this date. The first ones were Sister Sentia, Superior, Sister Bonaventura, Principal, and Sister Vermunda. Sister Salzia came in 1902 and remained until 1918. Following are the names of all the sisters who served here during the past. It was in 1853, a little more than a century ago, that the Rev. Augustine Ravuas of Mendota visited the Victoria settlement the first time. Until 1857, the settlement was visited about once or twice a year by either Father Ravu, Father Valentine Samarisen, or Father George Keller. These missionaries covered the area between St. Paul, St. Cloud, and Mankato. The trips had to be made on foot through the wilderness of the big woods, over roots and fallen trees, through heavy brush and boggy marshes. Thus these trips were made at a hazard to themselves to serve the Catholic settlements throughout the territory which they so zealously covered. There seems to be good evidence that the first Holy Massachusetts was read in the home of Michael Dython by Father Ravu in 1853, which incidentally was the first Mass read in Carver County. The second Mass offered in the settlement was at the home of John Meyer. It was then that John Breher, the infant son of Leonard Breher, was baptized. He was the first white child born in Carver County. Sister Victoria Teresa Schneider, OSF, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Engelbert Schneider, was born in 1858. She entered the Franciscan convent in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in 1882, and on A.U. August 15, 1882, was received into the order. The first 15 years of her religious life were spent in Wilmette, Illinois. Thereafter she worked at the Sacred Heart Sanitarium in Milwaukee for 25 years, after which she entered the home for retired sisters at Campbellsport, Wisconsin. She died there on June 16, 1954. Sister Avita Veronica Schmieg, OSB, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Schmieg, attended St. Victoria School and entered the Beanie Dictine Convent at St. Joseph, Minnesota on January 10, 1911. She made her profession of vows on July 11, 1912, after serving as cook and housekeeper at St. Bernard's in St. Paul, New Munich, and Anaconda, Montana. She is presently a seamstress at St. Joseph's home in St. Cloud. Sister Mechtild Helen Schmieg, OSB, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Schmieg, entered the convent at St. Joseph, Minnesota, on July 11, 1912, and professed her vows on July 11, 1916. She taught at St. Mary's School and Cathedral High School in St. Cloud, was superior and principal at Perham and Waite Park, Minnesota, and at present she is superintendent of St. Joseph's Home, St. Cloud, Minnesota. Sister Rolane Marilyn Dythelm, OSB, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernard M. Dythelm, was born on June 6, 1926. After attending St. Victoria Parochial School, she entered St. Benedict's Academy, St. Joseph, Minnesota in September 1940. Upon completing a year's novitiate, she pronounced simple vows in 1945 and solemn vows in 1948. She is presently teaching at St. Bernard's School, St. Paul, Minnesota. Sister Liberta Dorothy Williams, OSB, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. William Williams, was born on January 10, 1927. She entered the Benedictine novitiate at St. Joseph, Minnesota, on June 21, 1944, and made profession of vows on July 11, 1945. At present she is serving at the Jesuit Retreat House in St. Paul. Previous assignments were at Holy Angels in St. Cloud, St. Benedict's Convent, Most Holy Trinity, St. Louis Park, Most Holy Redeemer, Montgomery, and St. Boniface Convent, Hastings. Sister Eugene Eleanor Wortman, OSB, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ben Wortman, was born on July 25, 1931. In 1945, she entered the Convent of St. Benedict, St. Joseph, Minnesota, and made her final vows in 1952. She is now stationed at Assumption Convent, Richfield, Minnesota. The good fortune of selecting this territory for a home by the first settlers is borne out by the fact that within the last century, there was only one complete crop failure in this community. It took place in 1934, when there was no snow in the winter and no rain fell until the latter part of July. Over half of the grain and corn planted did not sprout until after the rain, and whatever grain did germinate in the spring was so stunted that it was almost worthless. The higher pastures were completely barren and the cattle were on the verge of starvation. All cattle, with the exception of a few, the best milk cows, were shipped to South St. Paul stockyards and were sold for a pittance because of their poor physical condition. $10 to $15 for a cow, which, under average conditions, was worth $100 to $150. The remainder of the cattle were kept alive, with wild hay, alfalfa, and oat straw shipped in from Iowa and Montana. In the early 1850s, there was a killing frost every spring and summer month of the year, ruining all vegetables, corn and beans. To have some kind of vegetable for their diet, the settlers picked young nettles growing profusely in the rich forest soil. They were served as salads, boiled soups, and otherwise used as is spinach. Today, a supply was dried and stored for winter use. This was not a complete failure, however, for the freeze did not kill the pastures, hay and hay crop, and the cattle did not suffer, in contrast to the excellent farming conditions prevailing in this area and the two failures described above. The Great Plain states of Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska, and South Dakota had 11 drought years in the last 50 years. Thus, the decision of the first settlers to establish themselves here in Minnesota proved to be very fortunate. In 1876, the statewide grasshopper scourge also affected the Irish area. The grasshoppers ate up all vegetation over which They passed and left the fields and pastures barren. The farmers tried to save their crops by building sheet metal pans about 6x20 feet, filling the bottom with tar, and then dragging them through the infested fields. This idea proved worthless, however, for within a minute or two the tar was completely covered with the hoppers, and new tar had to be added. Actually, the grasshoppers were so numerous that they obscured the sun when in flight. Governor John S. Pillsbury's message to the legislature in 1877, known as the Grasshopper Message, was filled with recommendations for counteracting the scourge and for the relief of its victims. No relief, however, was voted to alleviate losses sustained by the people in the affected areas. In about 1890, there was an infestation of chinch bugs in the area. By puncturing the roots of plants and sucking them dry, they damaged about 75% of the wheat crop. No harm was sustained by the barley and oat crops because they were hard with maturity when the little bugs appeared. The wheat, however, was just in the milk stage, and after being attacked, it bleached off in a day or two, leaving the kernels so shrunken that they
were worthless for flour. The yield was reduced to 3 bushels
per acre and could be used only for chicken feed. The corn crop was saved by the use of kerosene, filling a sprinkling can with this substance. The farmers sprayed a strip of ground around the field, and the bugs refused to cross the border. 50 gallons of kerosene at 8 to 10 cents per gallon kept the insects out of a 25-acre
field.
The scourge of the army worm, a species of caterpillar, occurred at the beginning of July in 1892. Where these worms came from, nobody knows, because none were observed the previous year. All of a sudden, it was noticed that all the basswood trees were being defoliated. After the worms had stripped the basswood, they attacked the maple, elm, ash, and oak, and ended up with the hickory, which has a rather bitter leaf. All of the trees grew a second crop of leaves, with the exception of the hickory, of which
99% died after the attack. Having stripped the wooded areas,
the worms entered the swamplands, and within a few hours all the willows were denuded. After cleaning a tree, the worms would descend by a web of their own making. Millions and millions of them were hanging in the air under the trees, so that cattle had to be kept out of the wooded pastures. The people protected their shade and fruit trees from the pests by painting a strip of axle grease around the bottom of the trunks, over which the worms would not pass. In the gardens, however, raspberries, gooseberries, currants, and grapes were all stripped. When all the foliage had
been eaten, the army of worms started on the march. They all traveled in the same direction, from west to east, and no obstruction
would make them deviate from their course. When they arrived at a building, they would climb up to the cornice and clutter up until the chunk got too heavy and fell to the ground. They could not be kept out of the houses unless the openings were protected with axle grease. Children could not go out to play but had to be kept in the house. The worms were literally everywhere.
There was not an inch of ground which was not covered with them.
The railroad tracks were so slippery with the pests that, incredible as it may seem, trains stopping at Victoria and Zumbra Heights
could not start on the grade out of town without backing up several miles to the west to pick up momentum to carry them over
the incline. Then, as quickly as the worms had appeared, they disappeared, and no one knew from where they had come, nor
where they went. When the pioneer days of the St.
Victoria Parish were over, and the days of bare existence and homesickness had passed into days of circumstance, the community still held 2 elements of national fame: the development of alfalfa
and the development of fruits which can
withstand the rigors of the severe Minnesota winters. The parish claims the honor of being the birthplace of Grim alfalfa,
wealthy and Haralson apples, Latham,
raspberries, Red Lake currants, plums, Wendell and R. cram pears, apricots, and other fruits. Victoria has not produced a great statesman, nor a great artist or poet. However, one of the parishioners, Wendell and Grimm, gained national fame by developing alfalfa known to this day by his name.
Grimm alfalfa. In 1857, Mr. Grimm emigrated from Kulheim in the Tauber Valley of the Duchy of Baden, Germany, and settled
in the parish area, about 3 miles northwest of the village of Victoria. He brought along about 20 pounds of seed which he named Ewiger.
Clee everlasting clover. He planted about 5 pounds of the seed.
That same fall of his arrival and 5 pounds more the next spring. That produced a perfect stand. That fall he planted the rest of the seed. A year or two later his entire stand of Ewiger Clee, with the exception of 2 plants, had frozen out. He then carefully nursed these 2 plants and gathered all the seed they produced and planted
it. Within a few years he had a good stand of the clover which did not freeze out. He raised all the seed he could and later sold the surplus to his neighbors. Within a few years the United States
Department of Agriculture proclaimed the Grimm strain of alfalfa as the only known alfalfa which could withstand the Minnesota winters. Grimm's persistence and patient work in developing this hardy legume has proved a boon to agriculture in the Northwest and paid off in uncounted millions of dollars. In appreciation for his services, the United States government has erected a monument to his memory on the farm where he carried on his experiments 3 miles northwest of Victoria. In 1907, the University of Minnesota bought the original Martin Fessler farm adjoining the eastern border of the village of Victoria and commenced to develop hardy fruits and berries to withstand the severe Minnesota winters. Fruit breeding is a continuous process. Pollen, cross-pollination, seeds, thousands of seedlings, a tedious and enormous job. In 1917, a dream apple appeared. It was a large red apple, well-shaped, a remarkable eating apple, good for cooking and keeping. It was named the Haralson apple. Then came the Underwood and other plums, the Latham raspberry and the Red Lake currant, the leading variety, followed. All these were
developed on the fruit breeding farm near Victoria, together with several varieties of pears and apricots which have withstood the
Minnesota winters for the last 10 to 15 years, 100 years of progress.
Our main purpose in writing the history of the St. Victoria Parish
was the recording of the names of the first missionaries, settlers, and conditions which existed in the beginning and confronted the pioneers who settled here during the first 25 to 30 years, with special emphasis on the members who organized the St. Victoria Parish.
We believe, however, that future generations will be interested
to know that the people who resided here during the last century have seen more giant, unbelievable strides in material progress than were made in the 2,000 years previous. Electric lights, stoves, motors, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, farm machinery, telephones, phonographs, radios, television, and all kinds of household equipment have appeared. Automobiles, submarines, supersonic aircraft tell the incredible advance of speed in transportation. In the beginning, passage from Europe to America required anywhere from 1 to 3 months, depending on favorable trade winds. The early settlers of this area had to travel through the Gulf of Mexico via the Mississippi River to St. Paul, for there were not as yet any railroads from the eastern United States to St. Paul. When they arrived here, they found only dense forest and no clearings. The only tools available were the axe, hoe, scythe, and tools of similar type. Iron nails were very scarce, and almost all of the log buildings were tied together with wooden pegs. It is not our intent here to re-describe conditions which existed at that time, but in order to record the speed with which new developments came about, we will dwell briefly on a few of the highlights. Houses were lighted with candles, kerosene and oil. Lamps were not in use until quite a few years after the beginning of the petroleum industry in 1859. Up to 1890, there was no market
for gasoline, which then sold for 2 ca gallon. Small threshing
machines appeared in the late 60s and were powered with a horsepower. In 1876, steam engines started threshing grain. Gasoline Tractors appeared in 1892. Today there are 4 million tractors. In 1897, Marconi invented wireless telegraphy, the forerunner of radio, radar, and television. The pioneer had to walk where he wanted. To go today, almost every family has at least one automobile. In the field of human endeavor, the greatest advance has been made in medical science. Since the beginning of the century, more has been learned about the causes, treatment, prevention, and control of disease than in any time in world history. As a result of this knowledge, the health of millions has been restored and their lifespan extended. Yes, the people who have lived in these last 100 years have seen more mechanization in machinery and more advance in medical science than all the people from the beginning of time to the 19th century. From September 1880 to December 1885, the pastor of the St. Victoria Church was Rev. Ambrose Jansen OFM, who was very interested in parish societies. He enrolled all the small children in the Holy Childhood Society. The dues, 12C per year, were used to support missions in the Far East. The young men and young women formed sodalities married. Women joined together in a Christian Mothers Society in the Mar. Reed men formed the St. Joseph Society, whose aim was to provide ways and means of maintaining the parochial school. Each of these sodalities had its distinct badge or sash and its own banner. In processions, they made an impressive appearance. These societies were a wholesome influence and helped to create a parish solidarity. Present societies are the Confraternity of Christian Mothers St. Francis Society St. Margaret Society Sodality of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the Association of the Holy Childhood. In the fall of 1928, Mrs. John A. Dytham was delegated to attend the annual convention of the Catholic Aid Association Women's Auxiliary and the Federation of Catholic Women at Wabasha, Minnesota. In July 1929, a meeting of all the ladies of the parish was held in the school hall, and it was agreed to meet regularly about once a month on a social basis and to charge a small fee which would be used for the support of the missions and the needy. The group decided to meet in different homes and charge L5C to play cards and bunco. The hostess would furnish small prizes and a lunch. A committee of 4 ladies would furnish the lunch. These meetings were a great moral and social success and continued for about 4 years without interruption. The meetings were discontinued in January 1942. In all, there were 102 meetings with sometimes as many as 65 ladies attending, and the total collections were $650.35. There also were many donations of used clothing and Catholic magazines
to be used in the work. The first officers were Mrs. Emil Seifert,
President Mrs. John Dytham, Secretary, and Mrs. Louis Klein, Treasurer.